Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through time with history for sleep. Tonight, we set sail upon the vast and mysterious oceans of the 15th and 16th centuries, an era when European ships ventured into unknown waters, when the maps of the world were redrawn forever, and when human understanding of our planet was transformed in ways both magnificent and tragic. Find your comfortable position now. Let the gentle rhythm of imaginary waves carry you as we explore the age of exploration together. There is no need to remember every detail, no test to prepare for. Simply allow these stories of distant voyages and world-changing discoveries to wash over you like the tide, carrying you peacefully toward restful sleep. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the weight of the day beginning to lift from your shoulders. Tonight, we become passengers on vessels that changed history, witnesses to moments when brave sailors gazed upon shores no European had ever seen, when the known world expanded beyond anything medieval minds had imagined possible. Let us begin our voyage. In the early 15th century, Europe existed in a state of geographic limitation that is difficult for us to fully appreciate today. The world as Europeans understood it consisted primarily of their own continent, parts of northern Africa, and portions of Asia that had been described by travelers and traders. Beyond these known lands stretched terra incognita, unknown territory filled in the imagination with monsters, boiling seas, and the edge of the flat earth where ships might tumble into the void. This understanding, while limited, was not simply the product of ignorance. It was shaped by the practical realities of medieval life, by the technologies available for travel and navigation, and by the information that had filtered down through centuries of scholarship, much of it derived from ancient Greek and Roman sources. The average person in medieval Europe rarely traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace. Life was local, centered on the village, the manor, the parish church. The seasons dictated the rhythm of existence, and the horizons of daily concern extended no further than the next harvest, the next market day, the next holy feast. The wider world, if thought of at all, existed as a realm of legend and religious significance rather than geographic reality. Yet within this seemingly limited world, there existed remarkable networks of connection. Trade routes linked distant cities, pilgrims traveled to sacred sites, scholars corresponded across kingdoms, and merchants transported goods that had originated in lands most Europeans would never see. The Mediterranean Sea served as the great highway of medieval European commerce. Italian city-states, particularly Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and Florence, had developed sophisticated trading networks that connected European markets with the riches of the East. Through these networks flowed silk from China, spices from the Indies, precious stones from India, and countless other luxuries that had become essential to European aristocratic life. These goods traveled overland along routes collectively known as the Silk Road, a term that actually describes multiple pathways connecting China, Central Asia, Persia, Arabia, and the Mediterranean world. Caravans of camels and horses carried merchandise across deserts and mountain ranges, through oasis cities and trading posts, changing hands multiple times before reaching European buyers. At each stage of this journey, middlemen took their profits. Arab merchants, Persian traders, Central Asian caravan masters, and finally Italian importers all added their margins to the cost of Eastern goods. By the time a pound of pepper or a bolt of silk reached a European customer, its price had multiplied many times over. This system had functioned for centuries, enriching the merchants who controlled its various stages and satisfying, if at considerable cost, European demand for exotic products. But the system had vulnerabilities that would become increasingly apparent as the 15th century progressed. The overland routes to Asia passed through regions of political instability. The Mongol Empire, which had once provided relative security along the Silk Road, had fragmented into competing khanates. Warfare, banditry, and the arbitrary demands of local rulers all threatened the smooth flow of trade. Disease, too, could disrupt commerce, as the devastating Black Death of the 14th century had so terribly demonstrated. More significantly, the rise of the Ottoman Empire was transforming the political geography of the Eastern Mediterranean and the lands beyond. The Ottomans, a Turkish dynasty that had established itself in Anatolia during the 13th century, were steadily expanding their territory, conquering Byzantine lands, and extending their influence across trade routes that had long connected Europe with Asia. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. This ancient city, the eastern capital of the Roman Empire, the seat of Orthodox Christianity, the gateway between Europe and Asia, had fallen to the forces of Sultan Mehmed II. The event seemed apocalyptic to many Europeans, a sign of divine displeasure, a harbinger of further calamities to come. In practical terms, the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople and the surrounding regions did not immediately sever European access to Asian trade goods. The Ottomans were pragmatic rulers who understood the value of commerce and generally allowed trade to continue, albeit under their control and subject to their taxation. But the political reality had changed dramatically. Christian European merchants now operated at the sufferance of Muslim rulers, and the long-term security of traditional trade routes could no longer be taken for granted. These concerns, combined with the perpetual desire to reduce costs and increase profits, began to generate interest in finding alternative routes to the sources of Eastern wealth. If the overland routes were problematic, perhaps sea routes might offer better possibilities. If the eastern path to Asia was blocked, perhaps a western path might be found. Such ideas were not entirely new. Medieval Europeans possessed knowledge, albeit imperfect, of the spherical nature of the earth. Educated people did not believe, as popular mythology would later suggest, that the world was flat. The ancient Greeks had demonstrated the earth's sphericity through logical argument and astronomical observation, and this knowledge had been preserved through the medieval period. The practical challenge was not conceptual, but technological. Ocean voyaging beyond sight of land required navigational skills and shipbuilding capabilities that medieval Europe had not yet fully developed. The Atlantic Ocean, with its unpredictable weather, strong currents, and vast distances, presented obstacles that Mediterranean seafaring traditions were ill-equipped to overcome. Yet the seeds of change were already present. Along the Atlantic coasts of Europe, maritime traditions quite different from those of the Mediterranean had been developing for centuries. The peoples of Portugal, Spain, France, England, and the Low Countries had their own seafaring cultures, adapted to the challenges of Atlantic waters and the fishing grounds of the North Sea. These Atlantic maritime traditions would provide the foundation for the great voyages of exploration that were soon to come. But before those voyages could begin, several crucial developments were necessary: improvements in ship design, advances in navigational technique, accumulation of geographic knowledge, and the emergence of political and economic conditions that would motivate and support extended ocean voyaging. The story of how these developments came together forms the prologue to the age of exploration itself. On the southwestern edge of the European continent, facing the endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, lay the small kingdom of Portugal. This nation, which had achieved its independence from the Spanish kingdoms of Leon and Castile during the 12th century, seemed an unlikely candidate to pioneer a new age of global exploration. With a population of perhaps 1 million people and limited agricultural resources, Portugal possessed neither the wealth nor the manpower of its larger European neighbors. Yet Portugal's very limitations would prove to be advantages in the coming century. The country's small size and coastal orientation meant that its people had always looked to the sea for sustenance and opportunity. Portuguese fishermen ranged far into the Atlantic, pursuing the cod and other species that formed a crucial part of the national diet. Portuguese merchants engaged in coastal trade around the Iberian Peninsula and beyond, developing skills in navigation and commerce that would serve the nation well. Moreover, Portugal's position at the southwestern corner of Europe made it the natural starting point for voyages southward along the African coast and westward into the Atlantic. Portuguese ports offered the last opportunity for ships to take on supplies before venturing into unknown waters, and the first refuge for vessels returning from distant voyages. The transformation of Portugal from a minor Atlantic kingdom into the pioneering nation of oceanic exploration began during the early 15th century, driven by a combination of economic necessity, religious motivation, strategic calculation, and the remarkable vision of a single royal prince. Prince Henry, known to history as Henry the Navigator, was the third surviving son of King John I of Portugal and his English queen, Philippa of Lancaster. Born in 1394, Henry grew to manhood during a period of Portuguese military expansion and national confidence. In 1415, he participated in the conquest of Ceuta, a Muslim-held city on the North African coast opposite Gibraltar, an experience that seems to have awakened his interest in Africa and the possibilities it might offer. The traditional image of Henry as a scholarly figure, surrounded by maps and charts at his legendary school of navigation at Sagres, directing fleets of discovery into unknown waters, has been considerably modified by modern historical research. There was no formal school at Sagres, and Henry's direct role in planning specific voyages was probably less significant than older accounts suggested. Nevertheless, Henry's patronage and support were crucial to the Portuguese exploration efforts of the mid-15th century. He provided financial backing for voyages, encouraged improvements in ship design and navigation, and created the political framework within which exploration could flourish. His persistence in the face of initial failures and his willingness to invest resources over decades laid the groundwork for later Portuguese successes. The early Portuguese expeditions were modest affairs, tentative probes southward along the African coast. Progress was slow, measured in incremental advances rather than dramatic leaps. The psychological barrier of Cape Bojador, a headland on the northwestern African coast, long marked the limit of Portuguese ventures. Medieval legend held that beyond this point lay the Sea of Darkness, where the sun's heat made the water boil and ships that ventured further would never return. In 1434, a Portuguese captain named Gil Eanes finally sailed past Cape Bojador and returned safely, demonstrating that the legends were false. This seemingly modest achievement opened the way for further exploration. In the years that followed, Portuguese ships pushed steadily southward, mapping the African coastline, establishing trading relationships with coastal peoples, and searching for a sea road around Africa to the riches of Asia. The voyages were facilitated by improvements in maritime technology that the Portuguese pioneered and refined. Most significant was the development of the caravel, a new type of ship that combined features from both Mediterranean and Atlantic shipbuilding traditions. The caravel was relatively small, typically displacing between 50 and 100 tons, but it was remarkably seaworthy and versatile. The key innovation was the caravel's rigging. Unlike Mediterranean ships, which typically used large square sails suitable for sailing before the wind, the caravel employed triangular lateen sails that could be adjusted to sail at angles to the wind. This capability was essential for Atlantic exploration, where ships needed to navigate against prevailing winds to return home after sailing southward along the African coast. The caravel was also designed with a relatively shallow draft, allowing it to navigate close to shore and explore rivers and estuaries that larger vessels could not enter. Its compact size made it economical to build and operate, reducing the financial risk of exploratory voyages. Though vulnerable in heavy seas, the caravel proved admirably suited to the coastal exploration that characterized the early Portuguese ventures. Navigation techniques also advanced during this period. Portuguese sailors refined the use of the compass, which had been introduced to Europe from China during the medieval period. They developed increasingly accurate methods of celestial navigation, using the position of the sun and stars to determine latitude. Charts and sailing directions accumulated with each voyage, building a body of practical knowledge that reduced the uncertainties of Atlantic navigation. The Portuguese also developed the systematic practice of recording and sharing navigational information. Unlike some maritime cultures, which guarded their knowledge as trade secrets, Portugal created institutions for collecting and preserving the data gathered by its explorers. This accumulation of knowledge meant that each voyage could build upon the discoveries of its predecessors. Progress down the African coast continued through the middle decades of the 15th century. Portuguese explorers mapped the coastline of what is now Mauritania, Senegal, Gambia, and Guinea-Bissau. They established trading posts where European goods could be exchanged for African products, including gold, ivory, and increasingly, enslaved human beings. The trade in enslaved Africans, which would become one of the most terrible legacies of the age of exploration, began during these early Portuguese ventures. The first enslaved Africans were brought to Portugal in 1441, and the trade expanded rapidly in subsequent decades. Initially, enslaved people were used primarily as domestic servants and agricultural laborers in Portugal and on the Atlantic islands that the Portuguese were colonizing. Later, the transatlantic slave trade would transport millions of Africans to the Americas under conditions of almost unimaginable cruelty. This aspect of the exploration era cannot be passed over in silence or relegated to a footnote. The voyages of discovery that opened new worlds to European knowledge also opened those worlds to European exploitation. The people of Africa, Asia, and the Americas would pay terrible prices for the curiosity and ambition that drove European ships across the oceans. As we trace the course of exploration, we must hold this reality clearly in mind. Prince Henry died in 1460, having devoted nearly half a century to promoting Portuguese exploration without living to see its greatest achievements. The voyages continued under subsequent Portuguese monarchs, though with varying intensity depending on political and economic circumstances. A crucial acceleration came during the reign of King John II, who assumed the Portuguese throne in 1481. John was determined to find a sea route around Africa to India, and he devoted substantial royal resources to achieving this goal. Under his patronage, Portuguese exploration entered its most ambitious phase. In 1488, a Portuguese expedition commanded by Bartolomeu Dias achieved a breakthrough that had been sought for decades. Sailing far south along the African coast, Dias's ships were caught by a violent storm that drove them southward for days out of sight of land. When the storm abated, the vessels sailed eastward, expecting to encounter the African coast, but found only open sea turning northward. They finally reached land and realized that they had rounded the southern tip of Africa. Dias wanted to continue toward India, but his exhausted crew insisted on returning home. The expedition sailed back along the African coast, finally sighting the cape that Dias named the Cape of Storms for the tempest that had driven them around it. King John, recognizing the significance of the discovery, renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, a signal of the optimism now attached to finding a sea route to Asia. The way to India lay open, though nearly a decade would pass before the Portuguese followed up on Dias's discovery. During this interval, events elsewhere in the Atlantic would transform the geographic understanding of the world and introduce a new competitor into the race for oceanic empire. While the Portuguese methodically worked their way around Africa, another approach to reaching Asia was taking shape in the minds of geographers and would-be explorers. If the Earth was spherical, as educated Europeans knew it to be, then Asia could theoretically be reached by sailing westward across the Atlantic as well as by sailing eastward around Africa. The question was whether such a voyage was practically possible. The concept was not new. The idea of reaching Asia by sailing west had been discussed for centuries. The challenge lay in determining whether the distance was manageable. The Atlantic Ocean might be narrow enough to cross with the ships and supplies available, or it might be so vast that no vessel could carry enough provisions to complete the journey. Ancient geographers had estimated the Earth's circumference with varying degrees of accuracy. Eratosthenes, in the 3rd century before Christ, had calculated a figure remarkably close to the modern measurement. But other ancient authorities had proposed smaller circumferences, and medieval scholars often gave weight to these lower estimates. Similarly, estimates of the east-west extent of Asia varied considerably. Some authorities extended Asia much further eastward than others, effectively narrowing the supposed ocean gap between Europe and the Asian coast. A geographer inclined to optimism about a westward voyage could construct calculations showing that Asia lay within practical sailing distance of Europe. A skeptic, using different sources and assumptions, could demonstrate that the voyage was impossibly long. Into this arena of geographic speculation stepped Christopher Columbus, a Genoese sailor who became the most famous and most controversial figure of the age of exploration. Columbus was born in the Italian city-state of Genoa around 1451 into a family of modest means engaged in the wool trade. As a young man, he went to sea, sailing on Genoese merchant vessels in the Mediterranean, and eventually making his way to Portugal, where he settled in the late 1470s. In Portugal, Columbus absorbed the maritime knowledge that decades of exploration had accumulated. He sailed to the Portuguese islands of the Azores and Madeira, and possibly ventured as far as the African coast and even Iceland. He married the daughter of a Portuguese nobleman who had been involved in Atlantic colonization, gaining access to charts and documents from earlier voyages. During his years in Portugal, Columbus became convinced that a westward voyage to Asia was not only possible but practical. He assembled geographic authorities and calculations that supported his vision, constructing an argument that placed Asia within reach of ships sailing from the Canary Islands. His estimates were wrong, as later events would dramatically demonstrate, but they were plausible enough to convince some contemporaries and, eventually, the Spanish monarchs who would sponsor his voyage. Columbus first sought support from the Portuguese crown, approaching King John II with his proposal, sometime in the mid-1480s. The king submitted the plan to a committee of experts, who rejected it. The Portuguese were committed to the African route, which was showing promise, and the expert opinion held that Columbus had underestimated the distance to Asia. The committee was correct, as it turned out, but their rejection sent Columbus elsewhere with his proposal. After leaving Portugal, Columbus approached the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, whose marriage had united the two most powerful kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula. Spain was not traditionally a maritime power on the scale of Portugal, but the unification of the Spanish kingdoms and the approaching completion of the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian campaign to recapture Iberia from Muslim rule, were freeing resources and attention for new ventures. Columbus presented his proposal to the Spanish court in 1486. The monarchs were intrigued but cautious. They appointed a commission to evaluate the plan, which dragged on for years without reaching a definitive conclusion. Columbus waited, lobbied, and struggled with poverty, while his proposal worked its way through the Spanish bureaucracy. The breakthrough came in early 1492, shortly after the fall of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain. With the Reconquista finally complete after nearly 8 centuries, Ferdinand and Isabella were ready to consider new projects. Columbus's proposal offered the possibility of reaching Asia ahead of the Portuguese, gaining access to the wealth of the Indies, and spreading Christianity to new lands. The monarchs agreed to support the voyage. The terms negotiated between Columbus and the Spanish crown were remarkably favorable to the explorer. Columbus was to be named Admiral of the Ocean Sea, a hereditary title carrying significant privileges. He would serve as viceroy and governor of any lands he discovered, with the right to appoint officials and administer justice. He would receive 10% of all revenues generated by his discoveries. These generous terms reflected both Columbus's negotiating skill and the Spanish perception that the voyage was a high-risk venture that might yield nothing. Columbus assembled a small fleet of 3 vessels for the voyage: the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The first 2 were caravels, while the Santa Maria was a larger but less maneuverable carrack that served as Columbus's flagship. The total crew numbered about 90 men, recruited from the ports and towns of southwestern Spain. On August 3, 1492, the fleet departed from Palos de la Frontera, sailing first to the Canary Islands to take on final supplies and make repairs. After a month in the Canaries, the ship set out westward into the open Atlantic on September 6. The voyage west was remarkably uneventful. The weather was generally favorable, with steady winds pushing the fleet toward its destination. Columbus's navigation, using dead reckonings supplemented by celestial observations, proved reasonably accurate. The main challenge was psychological rather than physical, keeping the crew's morale steady as the days stretched into weeks with no sight of land. Columbus employed various stratagems to maintain confidence. He kept 2 logs, one showing the actual distances sailed, and another with lower figures that he shared with the crew, hoping to minimize their awareness of how far from home they had traveled. He pointed to signs that land might be near, such as floating vegetation and birds, some of which were genuine indicators and others wishful thinking. As October began, the crew's anxiety intensified. Some accounts suggest that Columbus faced the threat of mutiny, with crew members demanding that the fleet turn back. Whether the situation was truly so dire is debated by historians, but certainly the tension was real. After more than a month at sea, with supplies diminishing and no land in sight, the men had reason to doubt whether they would ever see home again. Then, in the early hours of October 12, 1492, a lookout on the Pinta sighted land. As dawn broke, the fleet approached a small island, one of the Bahamas, though its exact identity remains disputed. Columbus and his officers went ashore, planted the Spanish flag, and claimed the land for Ferdinand and Isabella. They encountered the indigenous inhabitants, whom Columbus called Indians in the mistaken belief that he had reached the outskirts of Asia. This moment of first contact between Columbus and the Taino people of the Caribbean was the beginning of a transformation that would reshape the world. Neither party could have fully comprehended what was unfolding. For Columbus, the encounter confirmed his belief that he had reached Asia and opened vistas of wealth and glory. For the Taino, the arrival of these strange men with their ships, weapons, and incomprehensible purposes was the start of a catastrophe that would ultimately destroy their civilization. Columbus explored the Caribbean for several months, visiting multiple islands including Cuba and Hispaniola. He was searching for the wealthy Asian civilizations described by Marco Polo and other travelers, but found instead what seemed to him impoverished islands inhabited by simple peoples with little gold and no great cities. Yet he remained convinced that the Asian mainland and its riches lay just beyond his reach. The Santa Maria ran aground on the coast of Hispaniola and had to be abandoned. Columbus left a garrison of men at a settlement called La Navidad, constructed from the ship's timbers, and departed for Spain with the Niña and Pinta in January 1493. The return voyage was more difficult than the outward journey, with storms testing the vessels and their crews, but both ships eventually reached Spain safely. Columbus's return caused a sensation. He was received with honor by Ferdinand and Isabella, who confirmed his titles and privileges, and immediately began planning a second voyage. News of the discovery spread rapidly through Europe, prompting a mixture of excitement, skepticism, and concern about the implications for existing claims and agreements. The Spanish moved quickly to establish their rights over Columbus's discoveries. Pope Alexander VI, himself Spanish, issued a series of papal bulls in 1493 that granted Spain sovereignty over lands discovered west of a north-south line drawn in the Atlantic. Portugal protested, and the two powers eventually negotiated the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which moved the line westward. This agreement, made without any consultation with the peoples whose lands were being divided, would shape the colonial geography of the Americas for centuries to come. Columbus made 3 more voyages to the Caribbean, exploring the coastlines of Central and South America without ever clearly understanding that he had encountered continents unknown to Europeans. He clung to his belief that he had reached Asia until his death in 1506, never accepting that his calculations had been wrong, and that he had stumbled upon something far more significant than a western route to the Indies. The true nature of Columbus's discovery became clear only gradually, as subsequent explorers mapped the American coastlines, and as the geographic reality of 2 great continents between Europe and Asia became undeniable. Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine merchant and explorer who made voyages to South America in the late 1490s and early 1500s, was among the first to clearly articulate that these were new lands, a new world rather than an extension of Asia. The continents would eventually bear his name, though the process by which this happened was complex and somewhat arbitrary. Columbus's legacy remains deeply contested. For centuries, he was celebrated as a hero, the bold visionary who opened the Americas to European civilization. More recently, that celebration has been qualified by recognition of the devastating consequences his voyages set in motion: the decimation of indigenous populations by disease and violence, the enslavement of millions, the destruction of sophisticated cultures, and the establishment of colonial systems built on exploitation and oppression. Both aspects of this legacy are real. Columbus was a skilled navigator who accomplished something unprecedented, a voyage into the unknown that changed the course of history. He was also a man of his time, whose attitudes toward the peoples he encountered reflected and intensified the worst tendencies of European colonialism. Understanding the age of exploration requires holding both of these truths in mind, neither reducing Columbus to a simple hero nor erasing the genuine accomplishment amid the condemnation. While Columbus was exploring the Caribbean and searching in vain for Asian civilizations, the Portuguese were completing the project they had pursued for decades, finding a sea route around Africa to India and the Spice Islands. The discovery of the Cape of Good Hope by Bartolomé Diaz in 1488 had shown that such a route was possible. Now the Portuguese needed to follow through on that discovery and establish the trading connections that had motivated the search from the beginning. The delay of nearly 10 years between Diaz's voyage and the next major Portuguese expedition to India reflects the complexity of organizing such ventures. A voyage to India and back would take 2 years or more, require substantial investment in ships and supplies, and demand crews willing to face unprecedented dangers for uncertain rewards. The Portuguese crown needed to marshal resources, negotiate with potential investors, and select leadership capable of handling both the maritime and diplomatic challenges that lay ahead. The man chosen to lead this momentous expedition was Vasco da Gama, a nobleman from the town of Sines on the Portuguese coast. Da Gama was not the most experienced sailor available, but he possessed the combination of noble birth, demonstrated loyalty to the crown, and personal toughness that the mission seemed to require. His selection reflected the royal determination that this voyage would be not merely a commercial venture but an assertion of Portuguese sovereignty over whatever lands and trade routes it might establish. Da Gama's fleet consisted of 4 vessels, 2 newly constructed ships designed specifically for the Indian Ocean voyage, an older caravel, and a supply ship. The largest of the purpose-built vessels, the São Gabriel, served as Da Gama's flagship. The fleet carried a total complement of perhaps 170 men, including sailors, soldiers, interpreters, and specialists of various kinds. The expedition departed from Lisbon in July 1497. Rather than following the coast of Africa, as earlier Portuguese explorers had done, Da Gama took an innovative approach. After reaching the Cape Verde Islands off the African coast, he sailed far out into the Atlantic, swinging in a great arc to the southwest before turning east to approach the Cape of Good Hope from the open sea. This route took advantage of Atlantic wind patterns to speed the voyage, though it meant spending months out of sight of land. The strategy worked, and Da Gama's fleet rounded the Cape of Good Hope. In late November 1497, more than 4 months after leaving Portugal, the ships then worked their way up the east coast of Africa, entering a world that was new to European explorers, but ancient in its own trading traditions. The East African coast was part of a maritime trading network that stretched across the Indian Ocean, linking Africa with Arabia, Persia, India, and beyond. Swahili-speaking city-states like Mozambique, Kilwa, Mombasa, and Malindi had flourished for centuries as nodes in this network, exchanging African gold, ivory, and slaves for cloth, spices, and manufactured goods from Asia. Arab merchants played a central role in this trade, and Islam had become the dominant religion of the coastal elite. The Portuguese arrival disrupted this established world. Da Gama's fleet, armed with cannons and crewed by men whose religious hostility to Islam had been sharpened by centuries of conflict on the Iberian Peninsula, represented a fundamentally different kind of trading partner than the Arab merchants who had long dominated Indian Ocean commerce. Relations with the East African rulers were mixed. At Mozambique and Mombasa, the Portuguese encountered hostility and departed after brief and tense encounters. At Malindi, they received a warmer welcome and engaged the services of an Arab pilot who knew the route across the Indian Ocean to India. With this experienced guide, the fleet made the crossing during the spring of 1498, arriving on the Indian coast near Calicut in May. Calicut, located on the Malabar coast of southwestern India, was one of the great trading centers of the Indian Ocean world. Its ruler, the Zamorin, presided over a prosperous city where merchants from across Asia gathered to exchange goods. The Arab trading community was particularly influential, controlling much of the commerce in spices and other valuable commodities. Da Gama's reception at Calicut was disappointing. The gifts he had brought, appropriate for trade with African chiefs, were ridiculously inadequate for a sophisticated Indian court. The Arab merchants, recognizing the Portuguese as potential competitors and religious enemies, worked to undermine their position with the Zamorin. Trade negotiations yielded little of value, and Da Gama ultimately departed with only small quantities of spices and precious stones, far less than he had hoped to obtain. Nevertheless, the voyage was a success in its fundamental purpose, demonstrating that a sea route to India was practical. Da Gama's fleet returned to Portugal in 1499, having lost 2 ships and perhaps half its men to disease, accidents, and conflicts, but carrying proof that the goals sought for nearly a century had been achieved. The Portuguese now had direct access to the source of the spices that had enriched Italian middlemen and their Arab suppliers for centuries. The Portuguese moved quickly to exploit their advantage. A second, much larger expedition sailed for India in 1500, commanded by Pedro Álvares Cabral. This fleet of 13 ships carried enough men and supplies to establish a permanent trading presence on the Indian coast. During the voyage, Cabral swung so far west in the Atlantic that he made landfall on the coast of Brazil, claiming it for Portugal under the terms of the Treaty of Tordesillas. This accidental discovery would later prove immensely valuable, but at the time it was secondary to the main objective of reaching India. Cabral's fleet arrived at Calicut and established a trading factory, but relations with the local population deteriorated into violence. Arab merchants and their allies attacked the Portuguese compound, killing dozens of men. Cabral retaliated by bombarding the city with cannon fire before sailing south to the friendlier port of Cochin, where he was able to load his ships with valuable cargo. These early interactions established a pattern that would characterize Portuguese activity in the Indian Ocean for decades to come. The Portuguese possessed superior naval firepower, which allowed them to intimidate or defeat local forces in coastal waters. But they lacked the manpower to control territory on any significant scale. Their strategy therefore focused on establishing fortified trading posts at strategic locations, using the threat of naval bombardment to extract trading privileges, and attempting to divert commerce through Portuguese-controlled channels. Vasco da Gama returned to India in 1502, commanding a powerful fleet of 20 ships. His mission was to establish Portuguese dominance by force. He bombarded Calicut in revenge for the earlier attack on Portuguese traders, conducted acts of terrible violence against Arab ships and their passengers, and demonstrated that those who opposed Portuguese interests would pay a heavy price. The Portuguese began constructing a network of fortified bases across the Indian Ocean. The most important early acquisition was Goa, captured in 1510, which became the capital of Portuguese India and remained under Portuguese control until 1961. Other key positions included Hormuz at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, Malacca controlling the strait between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra, and eventually Macau on the coast of China. This Estado da India, the Portuguese state of India, was never a territorial empire in the conventional sense. Portuguese control extended only a few miles from their fortified positions. But the network of bases allowed the Portuguese to dominate key choke points in Indian Ocean trade, extracting profits through customs duties, protection fees, and the requirement that certain goods pass through Portuguese hands. The impact on the existing Indian Ocean trading system was significant but not total. Arab and Indian merchants continued to operate, often adapting to the Portuguese presence rather than being eliminated by it. Some rulers allied with the Portuguese against local rivals, while others resisted as best they could. The Portuguese themselves were too few in number to control all commerce, and their system gradually became one element in a complex trading environment rather than its exclusive master. For Portugal, however, the Asian trade was transformative. Spices, particularly pepper, flowed into Lisbon in quantities that had never been possible before. Portuguese merchants could now undersell their Italian competitors, who still relied on the expensive overland routes and multiple middlemen. The wealth generated by this trade funded further expansion and established Portugal, for a time, as one of the wealthiest nations in Europe. The human cost of this commercial success was high. Portuguese ships carried not only goods but disease, contributing to epidemics that devastated populations in Africa and Asia. The violence used to establish and maintain Portuguese positions caused suffering that is impossible to quantify but clearly immense. And the Portuguese participated actively in existing slave trades, while also developing new routes and markets for enslaved human beings. Yet the Portuguese achievement remains remarkable in its own terms. A small nation on the edge of Europe had, in less than a century, developed the maritime technology and navigational skill to reach the far side of the world and establish a trading empire spanning 3 continents. This achievement would be soon matched and eventually surpassed by other European powers. But Portugal showed the way and demonstrated what was possible. The discoveries of Columbus and da Gama raised immediate questions about sovereignty and rights. Who owned the lands that European explorers were claiming? Who could trade in the new routes they were opening? How should competing claims be resolved? In medieval European thought, the Pope, as the spiritual head of Christendom, possessed authority to make grants of sovereignty over non-Christian lands. This authority was based on the premise that Christian rulers had both the right and the duty to spread the faith to all peoples, and that the Pope could allocate this responsibility among Christian monarchs. The theoretical foundation was questionable even by medieval standards, and completely illegitimate by any principle recognizing the rights of non-European peoples, but it provided a framework that European powers found useful for settling their own disputes. When Columbus returned from his first voyage in 1493, the Spanish monarchs immediately sought papal confirmation of their rights to his discoveries. Pope Alexander VI, a Spaniard whose election had been supported by Ferdinand and Isabella, obliged with a series of bulls that granted Spain sovereignty over all lands discovered west of a line drawn from pole to pole 100 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands. Portugal protested this arrangement, which seemed to exclude Portuguese claims to lands that might lie in the western Atlantic. After negotiations between the two powers, the Treaty of Tordesillas was concluded in 1494, moving the line of demarcation significantly westward. The new line, located approximately 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, would prove to give Portugal a claim to Brazil, when that coast was discovered 6 years later, though whether this was foreseen at the time remains debated. The Treaty of Tordesillas was an extraordinary document, dividing the unknown world between 2 European kingdoms, without any consultation with the peoples actually living in the territories being allocated. Its audacity was matched only by its practical limitations. The precise location of the line was difficult to determine with the navigational techniques of the time, and neither Spain nor Portugal had the power to enforce their claims against other European nations that might choose to ignore the treaty. For several decades, Spain and Portugal did maintain effective dominance over their respective spheres of exploration and colonization. Portugal focused on the African coast, the Indian Ocean, and eventually Brazil, while Spain concentrated on the Caribbean, Mexico, Central America, and Peru. Other European powers, though they might resent being excluded, were preoccupied with internal affairs and lacked the maritime capabilities to challenge Iberian supremacy. The Treaty of Tordesillas also required a counterpart for the opposite side of the globe. If the division of the Western Atlantic needed to be clarified, so did the division of the East, where Portuguese and Spanish claims might eventually overlap. The Treaty of Zaragoza in 1529 addressed this issue, establishing an anti-meridian to complement the Tordesillas line and defining the boundary between Spanish and Portuguese spheres in the Pacific. The Iberian monopoly on oceanic exploration and trade began to erode as the 16th century progressed. Other European nations developed their own maritime capabilities and began to challenge the Spanish and Portuguese claims. The Protestant Reformation broke the religious unity of Western Christendom, and Protestant nations like England and the Dutch Republic felt no obligation to respect papal grants of sovereignty. French, English, and Dutch ships began to appear in waters that Spain and Portugal considered their exclusive domain. They came first as traders seeking to share in the profits of overseas commerce, then as raiders preying on Spanish treasure fleets, and eventually as colonizers establishing settlements of their own in the Americas and Asia. The Spanish and Portuguese defended their monopolies with force where they could, but they could not be everywhere at once. The vast distances involved, the limited numbers of Iberian ships and men, and the resourcefulness of interlopers all combined to make exclusive control impossible to maintain. Moreover, the very success of Iberian expansion created knowledge that could not be monopolized. As ships returned with information about new lands, winds, currents, and trading opportunities, that information inevitably spread beyond the Iberian kingdoms. Maps were copied, sailors switched allegiances, and printed accounts of voyages circulated across Europe. The monopoly on knowledge was even harder to maintain than the monopoly on trade. By the end of the 16th century, the framework established by the Tordesillas and Zaragoza treaties was becoming obsolete. The Dutch were establishing their own presence in the East Indies, challenging Portuguese dominance of the spice trade. The English and French were exploring the coast of North America, planting settlements that would eventually grow into powerful colonial empires. The neat division of the world between Spain and Portugal was giving way to a more competitive and chaotic reality. Yet the treaties remained significant as legal precedents and as expressions of how Europeans thought about their relationship with the non-European world. The assumption that European powers had the right to claim sovereignty over lands inhabited by non-Christian peoples, to divide those lands among themselves, and to exploit their resources for European benefit, was embedded in these early agreements, and would persist for centuries to come. The great voyages of the 15th and 16th centuries were made possible by developments in maritime technology that had been accumulating for generations. The ships that carried explorers across the oceans, the instruments they used for navigation, the weapons that gave them power over the peoples they encountered, all represented the culmination of centuries of innovation and refinement. The ships of the exploration era were sophisticated vessels that combined structural strength, carrying capacity, and sailing performance in ways that earlier designs had not achieved. The caravel, which has already been mentioned in connection with Portuguese exploration, was one important type. But the ocean-going ships that made the longest voyages were typically larger vessels known as carracks, naus, or in later periods, galleons. These ships shared certain basic features. They had multiple masts, typically 3 or 4, carrying a combination of square sails and lateen sails. The square sails provided power when sailing before the wind, while the lateen sails allowed sailing at angles to the wind and improved maneuverability. The hull was built using a technique called carvel construction, in which the planks were fitted edge to edge and fastened to internal frames, creating a smooth outer surface that was stronger and more seaworthy than the overlapping planks of older clinker construction. Below decks, these ships could carry substantial cargo, provisions for months at sea, and in some cases, armament that made them floating fortresses. The largest ships of the period might carry 50 or more cannons, enough firepower to bombard a city or defeat a fleet of traditional vessels. The development of effective shipboard artillery was itself a crucial factor in European expansion. By the late 15th century, European founders had learned to cast bronze cannons capable of firing heavy iron balls with devastating effect. These weapons, mounted on wheeled carriages that could be run out through ports in the ship's side, gave European vessels an overwhelming advantage in combat against ships from other maritime traditions that had not developed comparable firepower. Navigation across the open ocean required techniques quite different from the coastal pilotage that had sufficed for earlier maritime activities. Coastal navigation relied primarily on visual references, landmarks, the depth and character of the bottom as measured by sounding, and the pilot's accumulated knowledge of local conditions. Oceanic navigation required methods for determining position when no land was visible and might not be seen for weeks on end. The compass, introduced to Europe from China during the medieval period, provided a continuous reference for direction, regardless of weather conditions or visibility. By the 15th century, the magnetic compass had become an essential tool for European sailors, typically mounted in a binnacle where the helmsman could see it while steering. Determining latitude, the north-south position, was possible through celestial observation. In the northern hemisphere, the altitude of the North Star above the horizon equals the observer's latitude. During daylight hours, the altitude of the sun at noon could be used for the same purpose, though the calculation required knowledge of the sun's declination, which varies through the year. Portuguese navigators developed and refined instruments for measuring celestial altitudes. The quadrant, a quarter-circle device with a weighted plumb line, allowed direct reading of the altitude of stars or the sun. The astrolabe, adapted from instruments used by astronomers, served a similar purpose. Later, the cross staff provided another method for measuring the angle between a celestial body and the horizon. These instruments were crude by modern standards, and the observations taken with them were subject to considerable error. A skilled navigator might determine his latitude within a degree or so, enough to find a destination island or coast, but insufficient for precise positioning. Still, the ability to determine latitude at all represented a major advance over purely estimated navigation. Longitude, the east-west position, was a much harder problem. In theory, longitude could be determined by comparing local time, as shown by the sun's position, with the time at some reference location. But accurate timekeeping at sea was not possible with the clocks available in the exploration era. Shipboard conditions, with constant motion, varying temperature, and high humidity, defeated mechanical timekeeping devices that worked reasonably well on land. The longitude problem would not be satisfactorily solved until the 18th century, when John Harrison developed marine chronometers capable of keeping accurate time at sea. Navigators of the exploration era relied instead on dead reckoning, estimating their east-west progress by measuring their speed and the time sailed on each heading. This method accumulated errors over long voyages, sometimes with fatal consequences, but it was the best available. Charts and sailing directions complemented instrumental navigation. As voyages accumulated, the knowledge gained was recorded in documents that subsequent navigators could consult. Portolan charts, which had been developed for Mediterranean navigation, were extended to cover Atlantic waters. Rudders, written sailing directions describing courses, distances, landmarks, and hazards, were compiled for increasingly distant routes. The Portuguese were particularly systematic in gathering and preserving navigational information. The Casa da India in Lisbon served as a clearinghouse for data brought back by returning voyages, and access to this information was controlled as a state secret. Similar institutions, like the Spanish Casa de Contratación established in Seville in 1503, organized the navigation of other colonial empires. Beyond the ships and navigation instruments, the technology of exploration included the weapons that gave Europeans power over the peoples they encountered. European military technology in the exploration era was not necessarily superior to that of all other civilizations, but it was well suited to the particular circumstances of colonial warfare. Firearms, though still relatively primitive, were devastating against opponents who had never encountered them. The psychological impact of thunderous noise, smoke, and invisible projectiles that killed from a distance could be as significant as the actual casualties inflicted. Steel armor, swords, and crossbows gave Europeans advantages in close combat against many indigenous peoples, though these advantages could be neutralized by clever tactics or overwhelming numbers. The horse was perhaps the most important weapon in certain theaters of conquest. In the Americas, where horses had been extinct for thousands of years, the mounted Spanish soldier seemed an almost supernatural being. The combination of mobility, height advantage, and shock impact that cavalry provided made small numbers of Europeans effective against much larger indigenous forces. Disease, though not a technology in the conventional sense, was the most deadly weapon that Europeans brought to the New World. The populations of the Americas had evolved in isolation from the Eurasian disease pool, lacking immunity to smallpox, measles, influenza, and other infections that were endemic in the Old World. When these diseases reached the Americas, they spread with terrifying speed and lethality, killing perhaps 90% of the indigenous population within a century of first contact. This demographic catastrophe was not intentional genocide, at least not initially. European explorers and colonizers did not understand the germ theory of disease and did not deliberately introduce epidemics as a weapon of conquest, but the effect was the same regardless of intention. European expansion into the Americas was facilitated enormously by the depopulation that disease caused, making conquest and colonization possible on a scale that would otherwise have been unimaginable. The technology of exploration was thus a package of capabilities that reinforced each other. Ships that could cross oceans and carry heavy armament. Navigation techniques that allowed finding the way across vast distances. Weapons that gave military advantage against many opponents, and diseases that decimated populations that might otherwise have resisted European encroachment. Together, these technologies transformed the relationship between Europe and the rest of the world. We have now traced the foundations of the age of exploration, the medieval world, and its limitations, the Portuguese pioneering of Atlantic navigation, Columbus's momentous voyage and its unexpected consequences, the completion of the sea route to India, the Iberian division of the world, and the technologies that made oceanic expansion possible. In the chapters ahead, we will follow the explorers as they mapped the American continents, circumnavigated the globe, searched for new passages to Asia, and established the outlines of the world as we know it today. But for now, if sleep is approaching, allow yourself to drift. The gentle motion of imaginary ships, the soft sounds of wind in rigging and waves against hull, can carry you peacefully toward rest. There is no need to stay awake for more. The story will continue whenever you return. Sleep well, dear listener. The ocean is calm tonight. Welcome back to our journey through the age of exploration. If you are joining us from sleep, take a moment to settle comfortably. If you have been with us through the earlier chapters, let the narrative continue to carry you gently forward. The voyages of Columbus had revealed the existence of lands across the Atlantic, lands that would prove to be far larger and more significant than the islands Columbus initially explored. But before the Spanish turned their attention to the American mainland, they established their presence in the Caribbean, the chain of islands that had been Columbus's first destination, and that would serve as the staging ground for further expansion. The process by which Spain took control of the Caribbean was neither quick nor easy. The indigenous peoples of the islands, primarily the Taino and related groups, initially received the Spanish with curiosity and often hospitality. But the relationship quickly deteriorated as Spanish demands for gold, labor, and submission met resistance, and as the catastrophic impact of European diseases became apparent. Columbus himself set the pattern during his later voyages. Frustrated by the lack of gold and the difficulties of governing the Spanish settlers on Hispaniola, he imposed increasingly harsh measures on the indigenous population. Tribute in gold was demanded from communities that had never mined gold in such quantities. Labor was extracted through encomienda grants, which assigned groups of indigenous people to individual Spanish colonists who were supposed to protect and Christianize them in exchange for their work, but which in practice often amounted to slavery. The Taino population of Hispaniola, which may have numbered several 100,000 or more at the time of Columbus's arrival, collapsed with terrifying speed. Disease killed the majority, but violence, starvation, overwork, and despair contributed to a demographic disaster of staggering proportions. Within a generation, the Taino were nearly extinct as a people, and the Spanish were importing enslaved Africans to replace the indigenous laborers who had died. Similar patterns were repeated across the Caribbean. The islands of Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and Cuba were conquered in the early decades of the 16th century, their indigenous populations subjected to the same brutal regime that had destroyed the Taino of Hispaniola. The smaller islands were raided for slaves to replace workers lost on the larger ones, spreading destruction across the entire region. The Caribbean conquest established patterns that would characterize Spanish colonialism throughout the Americas. The encomienda system, with its combination of labor extraction and nominal religious responsibility, became the basic structure of Spanish indigenous relations. The focus on extracting precious metals, whether through tribute or direct mining, shaped economic priorities. The replacement of indigenous laborers with enslaved Africans, when the former became insufficient, initiated the transatlantic slave trade that would ultimately transport millions of people in chains. The Spanish also established the institutional framework for colonial governance. The Casa de Contratación in Seville controlled all trade with the Americas, licensing ships, collecting duties, and maintaining records. The Council of the Indies, established in 1524, oversaw colonial administration, legislation, and the appointment of officials. Viceroys, audiencias, and other bureaucratic structures extended royal authority across the ocean. The church was an integral part of this colonial system. Missionaries accompanied conquistadors, establishing parishes and monasteries, converting indigenous peoples, and recording information about the cultures they were simultaneously destroying and documenting. The relationship between crown and church in the Americas was governed by the Patronato Real, which gave Spanish monarchs extensive control over ecclesiastical appointments and revenues in exchange for their commitment to spread Christianity. The Caribbean islands, though eventually eclipsed by the mainland colonies in wealth and importance, remained crucial to the Spanish-American Empire. Havana became the assembly point for treasure fleets returning to Spain, its harbor offering protection from storms and pirates. Sugar cultivation, introduced from the Canary Islands and later from Brazil, transformed the Caribbean economy and intensified the demand for enslaved labor. But by the 1510s, the attention of ambitious Spaniards was turning to the mainland. Reports filtered back of wealthy indigenous civilizations beyond the islands, civilizations with gold and silver in quantities that made the Caribbean seem impoverished by comparison. The conquest of Mexico and Peru, the great set pieces of the Spanish conquest, were about to begin. In February 1519, a Spanish expedition of about 600 men, 16 horses, and a small number of cannons departed from Cuba for the coast of Mexico. The expedition was commanded by Hernán Cortés, a Spanish colonist who had come to the Caribbean as a young man and had spent years establishing himself as a landowner and local official on Cuba. Cortés was an unlikely candidate for one of history's most dramatic conquests. He was 34 years old, experienced in the ways of Caribbean colonialism, but not in military command. The expedition he led was organized on the model of previous ventures along the Mexican coast, which had brought back tantalizing reports of a wealthy civilization in the interior, but had not attempted conquest. The story of how Cortés and his small band overthrew the Aztec Empire is one of the most extraordinary episodes in world history. It has been told many times from many perspectives, and remains the subject of scholarly debate. What follows is necessarily a simplification of events that were complex, contingent, and understood very differently by their participants than they appear to us today. The Aztec Empire, or more properly the Triple Alliance of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, dominated central Mexico at the time of the Spanish arrival. The empire had been expanding for about a century, subjugating neighboring peoples and extracting tribute in goods and human victims for sacrifice. The capital, Tenochtitlan, built on islands in Lake Texcoco, was a city of perhaps 200,000 inhabitants, larger than any city in Spain and remarkable for its temples, palaces, markets, and engineering achievements. The Aztec ruler Moctezuma II presided over this empire from his palace in Tenochtitlan. He received reports of strange visitors on the coast, men who arrived in floating houses and possessed terrifying weapons that produced thunder and fire. The meaning of these reports was unclear. Were these visitors gods, as some interpretations suggested? Were they ambassadors from a distant ruler? Were they a threat that needed to be eliminated before it grew stronger? Moctezuma's response to the Spanish arrival has been interpreted variously as paralysis, religious confusion, sophisticated diplomacy, or calculated waiting. Whatever his reasoning, he chose initially to engage with the newcomers, rather than attempting to destroy them when they were most vulnerable. He sent gifts, including precious objects of gold, that confirmed Spanish beliefs about Mexican wealth. He attempted to discourage the Spanish from approaching Tenochtitlan, but his warnings only increased their determination. Cortés, for his part, pursued a strategy that combined military force with political manipulation. He quickly recognized that the Aztec Empire was not a unified state, but a system of tribute extraction that generated resentment among subject peoples. By presenting himself as a liberator and ally against Aztec domination, he was able to recruit indigenous allies who provided the manpower that his small Spanish force lacked. The most important of these allies were the Tlaxcalans, a people who had fiercely resisted Aztec domination and maintained their independence in an enclave surrounded by Aztec-controlled territory. After initially fighting the Spanish, the Tlaxcalans recognized an opportunity to advance their own interests by alliance with these powerful strangers. Thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors would fight alongside the Spanish in the campaigns that followed. The march to Tenochtitlan in the fall of 1519 was marked by a mixture of diplomacy and violence. At Cholula, an ally of the Aztecs, the Spanish and their indigenous allies massacred thousands of people in what Cortés claimed was a preemptive strike against a planned ambush. Whether the threat was real or fabricated, the massacre demonstrated Spanish ruthlessness and intimidated other communities along the route. In November 1519, the Spanish entered Tenochtitlan as guests of Moctezuma. They were housed in a palace within the city, surrounded by a population that vastly outnumbered them. Their position was precarious, dependent entirely on Moctezuma's continued willingness to host them. Cortés moved to improve his situation by taking Moctezuma into custody, making the emperor effectively a Spanish prisoner while maintaining the fiction that he remained in power. The Spanish occupation of Tenochtitlan lasted several months, during which time Cortés extracted gold, investigated the city's defenses, and consolidated his hold over Moctezuma. The situation exploded in May 1520, when Cortés had to leave the city to deal with a Spanish expedition sent from Cuba to arrest him. In his absence, his lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado ordered a massacre of Aztec nobles gathered for a religious festival, an atrocity that provoked a citywide uprising. Cortés returned to find his forces besieged in their palace compound. Moctezuma, brought out to calm the crowds, was either killed by Spanish weapons or struck down by missiles from his own outraged subjects, depending on which account one believes. The Spanish attempted to fight their way out of the city on the night of June 30, 1520, suffering terrible losses as they crossed the causeways amid constant attack. This night became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, though the sorrow was felt very differently by the two sides. The survivors regrouped in Tlaxcala, where their allies remained loyal despite the disaster. Over the following months, Cortés rebuilt his forces, received reinforcements from the Caribbean, and prepared for a siege of Tenochtitlan. Meanwhile, the Aztec capital was struck by a devastating smallpox epidemic that killed perhaps half the population, including Moctezuma's successor. The siege of Tenochtitlan began in May 1521 and lasted nearly 3 months. The Spanish and their indigenous allies, now numbering in the tens of thousands, surrounded the island city and cut off its supplies. Fighting was bitter and constant, with the defenders resisting house by house and street by street. The Spanish built brigantines, small warships that gave them control of the lake and prevented the Aztecs from receiving supplies by water. By August 1521, Tenochtitlan had fallen. The last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured trying to escape across the lake. The city was largely destroyed, its temples pulled down, its population decimated by fighting, starvation, and disease. On its ruins, the Spanish would build Mexico City, the capital of a new colonial order. The conquest of Mexico was not the work of Cortés and his few hundred Spaniards alone. It was accomplished through the alliance of European invaders with indigenous peoples who had their own reasons for wanting to see the Aztec Empire destroyed. The Tlaxcalans and other allies provided the majority of the fighting force, the local knowledge, and much of the logistical support that made victory possible. Nor was the conquest complete with the fall of Tenochtitlan. The Spanish spent decades extending their control over regions that had been only nominally part of the Aztec tribute system and never fully conquered some areas of Mexico. The Maya of the Yucatan Peninsula resisted for more than a century, and independent Maya communities persisted in remote areas until the 20th century. The consequences of the conquest for the indigenous peoples of Mexico were catastrophic. Population declined by perhaps 90% over the century following contact, as epidemic diseases swept through communities that had no immunity. Traditional political and religious structures were dismantled and replaced by Spanish colonial institutions. Land was appropriated for Spanish estates, and the surviving indigenous population was subjected to various forms of coerced labor. Yet indigenous cultures and peoples survived, adapted, and in some cases incorporated elements of the colonial system into new forms of identity and resistance. The Mexico that emerged from the colonial period was neither purely Spanish nor purely indigenous, but a complex mixture that continues to shape Mexican society today. The success of Cortés in Mexico inspired other conquistadors to seek similar opportunities for wealth and glory. News of the vast treasures extracted from the Aztec Empire spread through the Spanish Caribbean and reached Spain itself, drawing ambitious men eager to emulate Cortés's achievement. The most significant of these later conquests was that of the Inca Empire in Peru, accomplished by Francisco Pizarro and a small band of adventurers who faced even longer odds than Cortés had overcome. The story of the conquest of Peru combines remarkable courage, extraordinary luck, and appalling cruelty in measures that still generate debate among historians. Francisco Pizarro was born around 1475 in Trujillo, in the Extremadura region of Spain that produced so many conquistadors. He came to the Caribbean as a young man and participated in various expeditions, including Balboa's discovery of the Pacific Ocean in 1513. By the 1520s, he was a veteran colonist in Panama, looking for opportunities that the isthmus itself did not offer. Reports of a wealthy civilization far to the south had circulated for years. Pizarro organized expeditions to explore the Pacific coast of South America, enduring years of hardship, failure, and financial difficulties before finally gathering evidence of the Inca Empire's existence and wealth. In 1528, he returned to Spain to secure royal authorization and support for a conquest. The Inca Empire, or Tuantinsuyu as it was known in Quechua, was the largest indigenous polity in the Americas. Stretching along the Andes from modern Colombia to Chile, it incorporated perhaps 10 million people under the rule of the Sapa Inca, who was both emperor and divine figure. The empire had been built through military conquest over the century preceding Spanish contact, and like the Aztec system, it extracted tribute and labor from conquered peoples. When Pizarro's expedition reached the Peruvian coast in 1532, the Inca Empire was already in crisis. The previous Sapa Inca had died in an epidemic, probably smallpox that had spread from Mexico ahead of direct European contact. His sons Huáscar and Atahualpa had fought a devastating civil war for succession, which Atahualpa had just won when the Spanish arrived. Pizarro landed with approximately 168 men, 62 of them on horseback. This tiny force marched into the interior of an empire of millions, following the royal road that the Incas had built across their territory. They were heading toward Cajamarca, where Atahualpa was resting with his army after the victory over his brother. The meeting at Cajamarca in November 1532 was one of the most dramatic confrontations in world history. Atahualpa, confident in his military superiority, agreed to meet with the strangers who had entered his realm. He came to the town plaza, accompanied by thousands of attendants but, fatefully, without significant armed escort. What happened next remains controversial in its details but clear in its outcome. The Spanish priest Vicente de Valverde approached Atahualpa and, through interpreters, attempted to explain Christianity and Spanish sovereignty. A Bible or prayer book was offered to Atahualpa, who reportedly threw it to the ground after finding nothing meaningful in its pages. Valverde gave the signal, and the hidden Spanish soldiers attacked. The massacre that followed was one-sided and horrific. Spanish cavalry charged into the packed crowd, their swords and lances cutting down unarmed attendants who could neither flee nor fight back in the confined space. The cannons fired into the mass of bodies. Within an hour, thousands of Incas were dead, and Atahualpa was a Spanish prisoner. The capture of Atahualpa gave Paz an extraordinary advantage. The Inca Empire was built around the person of the Sopa Inca, who was the source of all authority and the living connection to the divine. With Atahualpa in Spanish hands, the imperial system was paralyzed. His generals, commanding armies that could easily have overwhelmed the tiny Spanish force, took no action for fear of endangering their ruler. Atahualpa attempted to buy his freedom by offering to fill a large room with gold and twice over with silver. The Spanish accepted, and treasures from across the empire were brought to Cajamarca and melted down into bullion. The ransom was an unimaginable fortune, enough to make every member of Pizarro's expedition wealthy beyond previous imagination. But Pizarro had no intention of releasing Atahualpa. The emperor knew too much, had too much authority, and might organize resistance if freed. After a show trial on charges including idolatry, polygamy, and the murder of his brother Huascar, Atahualpa was executed in August 1533. He had agreed to convert to Christianity, which spared him from burning and allowed him to be garroted instead. The Spanish then marched on Cuzco, the Inca capital, which they occupied without significant resistance. They installed a puppet ruler from the Inca royal family and began the process of extracting wealth and establishing colonial control. But unlike the conquest of Mexico, the conquest of Peru did not end with the capture of the capital. Resistance continued for decades. Members of the Inca royal family established a rump state in the remote region of Vilcabamba, maintaining their independence until 1572. Indigenous rebellions periodically challenged Spanish control, sometimes inflicting significant defeats on colonial forces. The Spanish themselves fell into civil wars over the division of spoils, with Pizarro and his partner Diego de Almagro becoming enemies and Pizarro eventually being assassinated by Almagro's supporters. The wealth extracted from Peru proved even greater than that of Mexico. The silver mines of Potosi, discovered in 1545 in what is now Bolivia, became the largest source of silver in the world. For centuries, silver flowed from Potosi to Spain, transforming the global economy and funding Spanish imperial ambitions. The human cost was terrible, as indigenous workers and later enslaved Africans died by the thousands in the brutal conditions of the mines. The conquest of Peru, like that of Mexico, was made possible by factors beyond Spanish military capability. Disease had already weakened the empire before Pizarro arrived. Civil war had divided the ruling elite. The centralized nature of Inca authority meant that capturing the Sapa Inca paralyzed the entire system. Indigenous allies, including groups resentful of Inca dominance, provided support to the invaders. Yet the achievements of the conquistadors remain remarkable. Small groups of men, isolated in distant lands, facing opponents who vastly outnumbered them, overthrew two of the largest empires in the Americas. Their success was not inevitable, and slightly different circumstances might have produced very different outcomes. But succeed they did, and the world was transformed as a result. While the conquistadors were subjugating indigenous empires in the Americas, other explorers were pushing back the boundaries of geographic knowledge in a different direction. The most ambitious voyage of the Age of Exploration was undertaken by a fleet that left Spain in 1519 with the goal of reaching Asia by sailing west, finding a passage through or around the American landmass, and returning home by continuing westward around the globe. Ferdinand Magellan, who conceived and commanded this expedition, was Portuguese by birth, born around 1480 to a family of minor nobility. He served the Portuguese crown in India and North Africa, gaining experience in navigation and warfare. But a dispute over finances and honor led him to renounce his Portuguese allegiance and offer his services to Spain. Magellan's proposal was bold to find a western route to the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, that would fall within the Spanish sphere as defined by the Treaty of Tordesillas and its Pacific counterpart. The Portuguese route around Africa was long and difficult, and the Portuguese jealously guarded their monopoly on it. If a western passage could be found, Spain might access the lucrative spice trade without challenging Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean. The Spanish crown accepted Magellan's proposal, providing 5 ships and about 270 men for the expedition. The fleet sailed from Spain in September 1519, crossed the Atlantic to Brazil, and began working its way down the South American coast, searching for the passage that Magellan believed must exist. The journey down the coast was difficult and slow. The fleet wintered at Puerto San Julian in Patagonia, where Magellan faced and suppressed a mutiny among Spanish officers who resented serving under a Portuguese commander. One ship was lost exploring the Rio de la Plata, which proved to be a river rather than a strait. In October 1520, the fleet entered a passage at the southern tip of South America that would eventually bear Magellan's name. The Strait of Magellan is a complex waterway, over 300 miles long, winding between the mainland and the archipelago of Tierra del Fuego. The passage took more than a month to navigate, with one ship deserting and returning to Spain. But on November 28, 1520, the remaining 3 vessels emerged into the Pacific Ocean. The crossing of the Pacific proved far more grueling than anyone had anticipated. Magellan and his contemporaries had underestimated the ocean's width, expecting to reach Asia within weeks. Instead, the voyage lasted more than 3 months, during which the fleet saw almost no land and ran desperately short of food and water. Men died of scurvy, the disease caused by vitamin C deficiency that would plague long ocean voyages for centuries. In March 1521, the fleet reached the islands of the Western Pacific, now known as the Philippines. The expedition had achieved its primary geographic objective, demonstrating that Asia could be reached by sailing west. But the voyage was far from over, and Magellan himself would not see its completion. In the Philippines, Magellan became involved in local politics, forming an alliance with the ruler of Cebu and agreeing to support him against rivals on neighboring islands. In April 1521, Magellan led an attack on the island of Mactan, confident that European weapons would easily defeat any indigenous resistance. He was wrong. In the battle that followed, Magellan was killed, along with several of his men. The survivors abandoned their effort to establish trade in the Philippines and sailed for the Spice Islands. They reached the Moluccas in November 1521, loaded their ships with cloves, and prepared for the return journey. One ship attempted to sail back across the Pacific, but was eventually captured by the Portuguese. The other, the Victoria, commanded by Juan Sebastián Elcano, set out westward across the Indian Ocean. The Victoria's voyage home was another ordeal of hunger, disease, and danger. The ship had to avoid Portuguese-controlled waters, sailing far south around the Cape of Good Hope, rather than calling at ports where the crew might be arrested. By the time the Victoria reached Spain in September 1522, only 18 of the original expedition's 270 members remained aboard. These 18 men were the first humans known to have circumnavigated the Earth. Their voyage had demonstrated conclusively that the world was a globe, that the Americas were separate continents between Europe and Asia, and that a westward route to the Spice Islands, though possible, was impractical for regular commerce. The expedition also provided the first direct observation of the international date line phenomenon. Pigafetta, who kept a journal of the voyage, was astonished to find upon reaching the Cape Verde Islands that his carefully maintained calendar was 1 day behind the local date. The explanation, that sailing continuously westward meant experiencing one fewer sunset than those who remained stationary, required rethinking basic assumptions about time and space. Magellan himself is remembered as the expedition's leader, though he completed only half the circumnavigation. His determination, his navigational skill, and his vision made the voyage possible. But he was also a harsh commander whose treatment of his crew and involvement in indigenous conflicts contributed to his own death and the expedition's heavy losses. The practical impact of the circumnavigation was limited. The western route to Asia was too long and difficult for regular trade. Spain eventually sold its claims to the Moluccas to Portugal in 1529, accepting the reality that the spice trade would remain in Portuguese hands. But the intellectual and psychological impact was profound. The shape of the world was now known, at least in outline. The age of geographic speculation was giving way to an age of precise mapping and systematic knowledge. The discovery that the American continents blocked the westward route to Asia, and that the passage around South America was impractically long and difficult, generated interest in finding alternative routes. Perhaps a passage existed through or around the northern part of North America, providing a shorter route to the Pacific and the riches of Asia. Perhaps a similar passage existed around the northern coast of Europe and Asia. These hoped-for routes became known as the Northwest Passage and the Northeast Passage, and the search for them would occupy explorers for centuries. The Northwest Passage was the more intensively sought of the two, primarily because it fell within the spheres claimed by England and France, nations that were eager to find their own routes to Asia and were willing to challenge Spanish and Portuguese monopolies. English interest in the passage began in the reign of Henry VII, who sponsored John Cabot's voyage to North America in 1497. Cabot, a Venetian navigator also known as Giovanni Caboto, sailed from Bristol in the small ship Matthew with a crew of about 18 men. In June 1497, he made landfall somewhere on the coast of North America, probably in Newfoundland or Nova Scotia. Cabot believed he had reached Asia, specifically the coast of China, and he returned to England with reports of a land rich in fish and presumably closed to the riches of the East. Henry VII was sufficiently encouraged to sponsor a second voyage in 1498, this time with 5 ships. The expedition disappeared without a trace, and Cabot's fate remains unknown. Some evidence suggests that at least some ships reached North America and explored the coast before being lost, but the details are irrecoverable. The English interest in North America languished for decades after Cabot's disappearance. Henry VIII was preoccupied with continental affairs and religious controversies, and the Caribbean and South American wealth flowing into Spanish coffers seemed to suggest that the most valuable discoveries had already been made. It was not until the reign of Elizabeth I that English exploration revived in earnest. By the 1570s, England was emerging as a significant naval power, and English sailors were beginning to challenge Spanish dominance in American waters. Sir Francis Drake's circumnavigation of 1577 to 1580 demonstrated that English ships could operate anywhere in the world, and the wealth Drake brought back from raiding Spanish vessels encouraged further ventures. Martin Frobisher led 3 expeditions to the Arctic between 1576 and 1578, searching for the Northwest Passage and, increasingly, for gold that he believed he had discovered on Baffin Island. The gold proved to be worthless iron pyrite, but Frobisher's voyages contributed to knowledge of the North American Arctic, even as they demonstrated the difficulties of navigation in those waters. John Davis made 3 voyages between 1585 and 1587, exploring the strait between Greenland and Baffin Island that now bears his name. He reached further north than any previous explorer, mapping coastlines and collecting information that would guide later navigators. Like Frobisher, He did not find a passage, but he narrowed the search area and proved that the Arctic could be navigated, at least during the brief summer season. Henry Hudson, sailing for the English and later the Dutch, made 4 voyages between 1607 and 1611 in search of northern passages. His 3rd voyage under Dutch sponsorship explored the river that bears his name and established Dutch claims to the region that would become New York. His 4th voyage for England took him into the Great Bay in northern Canada that also carries his name. There his crew mutinied, setting Hudson, his son, and loyal crew members adrift in a small boat. They were never seen again. The search for the Northwest Passage continued through subsequent centuries, driving exploration of the Canadian Arctic and costing many lives in the process. The passage exists, but it is blocked by ice for most of the year and remained impractical for commercial navigation until climate change began opening it in recent decades. The Northeast Passage, the potential route around the northern coast of Europe and Asia, attracted less attention than its western counterpart, but was not entirely neglected. The English Muscovy Company, founded in 1555, grew out of an expedition that had sought a northeastern route to Asia. The expedition's leader, Sir Hugh Willoughby, died with most of his crew when their ship became trapped in Arctic ice. But one ship, commanded by Richard Chancellor, reached the White Sea and eventually Moscow, opening trade relations between England and Russia. Dutch navigator Willem Barents made 3 voyages to the Arctic between 1594 and 1597, searching for a northeastern route. On his 3rd voyage, his ship became trapped in ice off the coast of Novaya Zemlya, and he and his crew spent a winter in the Arctic, surviving by building a shelter from driftwood and hunting for food. Barents died during the attempt to escape in the following summer, but some of his crew reached safety and returned to the Netherlands with their remarkable story of survival. The Northeast Passage would eventually be navigated, first by Swedish explorer Adolf Erik Nordenskjöld in 1878 to 1879, using a combination of sailing and steam power. Regular navigation of the route, now known as the Northern Sea Route, became possible only with the development of nuclear-powered icebreakers in the Soviet era. The search for northern passages, though it failed to achieve its original objective, contributed enormously to geographic knowledge and established European presence in regions that had previously been unknown to Europeans. The exploration of the Canadian Arctic, the mapping of Greenland's coasts, and the opening of Russia to Western trade were all consequences of the quest for routes that turned out to be impractical. The Pacific Ocean, the largest body of water on Earth, covering more area than all the world's landmasses combined, was the last major geographic frontier to be mapped by European explorers. Magellan's crossing had demonstrated the ocean's existence and vast extent, but decades passed before systematic exploration began. The Spanish were the first Europeans to establish a regular presence in the Pacific. The annual Manila Galleon, which began sailing in 1565, connected the Philippines with New Spain, carrying Chinese goods westward to Mexico and American silver eastward to Asia. The voyage from Manila to Acapulco took advantage of winds and currents that carried ships north to Japan and then across to the California coast before turning south. The return voyage followed a more southerly route, exploiting the trade winds that Magellan had discovered. The Manila Galleon route did not encourage Pacific exploration. Spanish captains had every incentive to complete their crossings as quickly as possible, avoiding the islands that dotted the ocean and the unpredictable weather that could destroy ships far from any harbor. The Pacific remained largely unknown, a vast blue void on maps that showed only a few scattered discoveries. Portuguese explorers encountered the Pacific from the west, reaching the Moluccas in 1512 and establishing trading relationships that made them masters of the spice trade. Portuguese ships explored the coasts of New Guinea and may have sighted Australia, though the evidence for pre-Dutch discovery remains debated. The Portuguese focus was on commerce rather than exploration, and they showed little interest in the seemingly worthless lands that lay between their Asian trading posts and Spanish America. Spanish expeditions from Peru explored parts of the South Pacific during the 16th century. Alvaro de Mendaña discovered the Solomon Islands in 1568, naming them for the biblical king whose wealth they hopefully might rival. A second expedition in 1595 attempted to establish a colony in the Solomons but ended in disaster after failing to relocate the islands. The chief pilot of this expedition, Pedro Fernández de Quiros, led his own voyage in 1605 to 1606, discovering the New Hebrides and becoming convinced he had found the great southern continent that geographers believed must exist. The concept of Terra Australis, a massive southern landmass, had ancient origins. Greek geographers had reasoned that the known lands of the northern hemisphere must be balanced by comparable lands in the south to prevent the Earth from toppling over. This theoretical construct persisted through the medieval period and influenced explorers well into the 18th century. Quiros was not the last to believe he had found it. Dutch exploration of the Pacific began in earnest during the early 17th century. The Dutch East India Company, established in 1602, was primarily interested in the spice trade of the East Indies, but its ships accumulated considerable geographic knowledge in the course of their commercial activities. In 1606, the same year Quiros was exploring the New Hebrides, Willem Janszoon, sailing for the Dutch East India Company, made the first recorded European contact with Australia, landing on the western side of Cape York Peninsula in what is now Queensland. Janszoon did not realize he had discovered a new continent, regarding the land as part of New Guinea. Over the following decades, Dutch ships mapped large portions of Australia's western and southern coasts, though usually as a result of accidents rather than deliberate exploration. Ships sailing from the Cape of Good Hope to Java sometimes sailed too far east and struck the Australian coast. The land they found was dry, apparently uninhabited or inhabited by peoples uninterested in trade, and seemingly worthless. The Dutch named it New Holland and showed little interest in its colonization. The most ambitious Dutch Pacific expedition was that of Abel Tasman in 1642 to 1643. Tasked with exploring the southern oceans and searching for the great southern continent, Tasman circumnavigated Australia without ever sighting it, instead discovering Tasmania, New Zealand, Tonga, and Fiji. His voyage established that New Holland was not connected to any larger southern landmass, but it also demonstrated that the Pacific islands he encountered offered little commercial value to Dutch merchants. English exploration of the Pacific began with Drake's circumnavigation and continued intermittently through the 17th century. William Dampier, an English privateer turned explorer, made 3 voyages to the Pacific between 1683 and 1711, publishing accounts that were widely read and that contributed to European knowledge of the region. Dampier's descriptions of Australia's western coast and its aboriginal inhabitants, though brief, were the most detailed available in English until the voyages of James Cook. The systematic exploration and mapping of the Pacific would have to wait for the 18th century, when scientific curiosity, imperial competition, and improved navigational techniques combined to drive a new era of discovery. The voyages of Cook, Bougainville, and La Pérouse would finally reveal the geography of the world's largest ocean and complete the mapping of the globe that had begun with Portuguese voyages along the African coast 3 centuries earlier. We have now traced the dramatic events of the early exploration era, the Spanish conquest of the Caribbean and the great indigenous empires of Mexico and Peru, the first circumnavigation of the globe, the search for northern passages, and the early exploration of the Pacific. In the chapters ahead, we will examine the broader consequences of these discoveries, the exchange of plants, animals, and diseases between the Old World and the New, the expansion of European colonialism, and the transformation of global trade and culture. But if sleep is approaching, let yourself drift peacefully toward rest. The stories we have shared tonight will be waiting whenever you return, and there is no need to stay awake for more. Sleep well, dear listener. The world grows larger in our dreams. Welcome back to our voyage through history. If you are continuing from earlier chapters, let the narrative flow gently onward. If you are joining us anew, settle comfortably and let these stories carry you toward peaceful rest. The voyages of exploration connected parts of the world, that had been separated for thousands of years, since the last ice age land bridges had disappeared beneath rising seas. The consequences of this reconnection were profound and far-reaching, transforming the biology, demography, and cultures of every continent. Historians have come to call this process the Columbian Exchange, recognizing that what passed between the hemispheres was not merely trade goods, but the foundations of life itself. The most devastating element of this exchange was disease. The peoples of the Americas, isolated from the Eurasian disease pool for millennia, had no immunity to infections that were common in the Old World. When European ships brought smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and other diseases to the Americas, the result was demographic catastrophe on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. Estimates of the pre-Columbian population of the Americas vary widely, from a low of around 8 million to a high of over 100 million. Whatever the starting point, the decline over the century following contact was catastrophic. In some regions, 90% or more of the indigenous population perished. Entire peoples disappeared, their languages, knowledge, and ways of life vanishing with them. The island of Hispaniola, where Columbus established the first Spanish settlement, provides a stark example. The Taino population, estimated at perhaps several hundred thousand at contact, was virtually extinct within 50 years. The mainland populations were larger and more dispersed, but they too suffered devastating losses. Central Mexico may have declined from around 25 million to 1 million by 1600. Similar patterns occurred throughout the Americas. This demographic collapse was not primarily the result of violence, though violence certainly played a role. Disease killed far more people than weapons ever did. The epidemics spread faster than the conquistadors themselves, often reaching communities before any European had arrived. The peoples struck by these plagues had no understanding of what was happening to them, no inherited wisdom about how to respond to diseases they had never encountered. The psychological and spiritual impact of the epidemics was as significant as their physical toll. Traditional healing practices proved useless against the new diseases. Religious rituals that had always restored balance and health failed utterly. Community structures broke down as the sick were abandoned by the healthy, or as entire communities sickened simultaneously, with no one able to care for the ill. The apparent invincibility of the Europeans, who seemed immune to the plagues that devastated indigenous peoples, contributed to the sense that the old order had been overturned by forces beyond human comprehension. The exchange of disease was not entirely one-sided. Syphilis appears to have been brought to Europe from the Americas, spreading rapidly after Columbus's return and causing significant mortality and suffering. But this was the only major disease to travel eastward, and its impact, though serious, was nothing comparable to the devastation that Old World diseases caused in the New. The exchange of plants transformed agriculture on both sides of the Atlantic. American crops that had been domesticated over thousands of years by indigenous peoples became staples of world agriculture. Maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, tobacco, squash, beans, peppers, and many other plants were introduced to Europe, Africa, and Asia, where they were adopted with varying degrees of enthusiasm and eventually became integral to local cuisines and economies. The potato, native to the Andes, became a crucial food crop in northern Europe, where it thrived in cool, damp conditions that suited it better than traditional grains. The potato's high yield and nutritional value allowed population growth in regions like Ireland, where it became the primary food source for the peasant population. This dependence would prove disastrous when potato blight struck in the 1840s, causing the Great Famine, but for centuries before that, the American tuber had supported an expanding European population. Maize spread across Africa and Asia as well as Europe, becoming a staple crop in regions with suitable growing conditions. Its high yields and relative ease of cultivation made it attractive to farmers, even when local prejudices initially dismissed it as fit only for animal fodder. In time, maize became essential to the food systems of societies far removed from its Mexican origins. Tomatoes, initially regarded with suspicion in Europe because of their resemblance to poisonous nightshade relatives, eventually transformed Mediterranean cuisine. Italian cooking without tomatoes is almost inconceivable today, yet the tomato is entirely a New World contribution. Similar stories could be told of peppers, which revolutionized Asian cuisines, or cacao, which introduced the world to chocolate. Old World crops traveled to the Americas in return. Wheat, rice, barley, and other Eurasian grains were planted in suitable American environments, transforming agriculture in regions where indigenous crops had been different. Sugar cane, originally from Asia, was introduced to the Caribbean and Brazil, creating plantation economies that would reshape the Atlantic world. Coffee, native to Africa, was introduced to the Americas and found ideal growing conditions in regions like Brazil and Central America. The global coffee industry that developed would eventually make these American producers dominant in a commodity that had originated an ocean away. Animals exchanged between the hemispheres had equally transformative effects. The Americas before Columbus had relatively few domesticated animals. Dogs, turkeys, guinea pigs, llamas, and alpacas were the most important. The horse, donkey, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens that Europeans brought with them revolutionized American economies and ecologies. The horse perhaps had the most dramatic cultural impact. Native American peoples who adopted the horse, particularly those of the Great Plains, developed entirely new ways of life based on mounted hunting and warfare. The horse-mounted warrior societies that Europeans encountered on the American frontier were not ancient traditions but creative adaptations to the transformed world that European contact had created. Cattle and other livestock transformed the American landscape. Herds of cattle spread across grasslands, while pigs, able to survive in almost any environment, multiplied and sometimes went feral, becoming pests that damaged indigenous gardens and food sources. The ecological transformation was far-reaching, as European plants and animals displaced or destroyed native species and altered landscapes that had been shaped by thousands of years of indigenous management. The Columbian Exchange was not a simple transfer of goods between equal trading partners. It was an asymmetric process driven by conquest and colonization, in which the peoples of the Americas bore the heaviest costs while Europeans reaped most of the benefits. The plants, animals, and diseases that crossed the Atlantic transformed the world, but that transformation came at a terrible human price. Among the most terrible consequences of the age of exploration was the transatlantic slave trade, which over 4 centuries transported an estimated 12 million Africans across the Atlantic in conditions of unimaginable cruelty. This forced migration was the largest in human history, and its effects continue to shape the societies of Africa, the Americas, and Europe today. Slavery had existed in Africa, as in most parts of the world, long before Europeans arrived. African societies practiced various forms of bondage, ranging from debt servitude to chattel slavery, and enslaved people were traded across the Sahara to North Africa and the Middle East. But the Atlantic slave trade was different in scale, intensity, and the racial ideology that came to justify it. The origins of the Atlantic slave trade lay in the early Portuguese exploration of the African coast. As Portuguese ships pushed southward during the 15th century, they encountered African societies willing to exchange captives for European goods. The first enslaved Africans arrived in Portugal in 1441, beginning a commerce that would grow exponentially over the following centuries. Initially, enslaved Africans were brought to Portugal itself and to the Atlantic islands, the Madeiras, the Azores, the Canaries, and the Cape Verde Islands, where they worked on sugar plantations and in other enterprises. The sugar economy, which had developed in the Mediterranean and been transferred to these islands, created a demand for labor that free workers could not satisfy. The conquest of the Americas and the demographic collapse of indigenous populations transformed the scale of the slave trade. Sugar plantations established in Brazil and the Caribbean required vast amounts of labor, and the surviving indigenous peoples were insufficient in number and often unsuitable for plantation work. Enslaved Africans were seen as the solution, and the transatlantic slave trade expanded to meet the demand. The slave trade operated through networks of African rulers, merchants, and middlemen who captured or purchased people in the African interior, and brought them to coastal trading posts for sale to European ships. The Europeans generally did not venture into the interior themselves, depending on African partners to supply their human cargo. The conditions of the Middle Passage, the voyage across the Atlantic, were horrific. Captives were packed into ships with minimal space, chained together in holds with inadequate ventilation, food, and water. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions, and mortality rates were high, often exceeding 20% of those embarked. Those who survived the crossing arrived in the Americas traumatized, weakened, and facing lives of brutal exploitation. The destinations of enslaved Africans varied over time and reflected the shifting geography of the plantation economy. Brazil received the largest number, perhaps 4 million over the course of the trade. The Caribbean islands, particularly Jamaica, Saint Domingue, Haiti, Cuba, and Barbados, received millions more. The mainland colonies of North America received a smaller share, perhaps 400,000, but natural increase meant that the enslaved population of the United States grew to 4 million by the time of the Civil War. The work that enslaved people performed was varied, but often centered on plantation agriculture. Sugar production was the most important and most deadly, with the labor demands of cutting cane, operating the mills, and boiling the juice, killing workers at rates that required constant importation of new captives. Tobacco, rice, cotton, and coffee also relied heavily on enslaved labor, as did mining operations and domestic service. The treatment of enslaved people ranged from terrible to horrific. Legally, enslaved people were property, subject to the absolute authority of their owners. Physical punishment, including whipping, branding, and mutilation, was routine. Families were separated at the owner's convenience, with children sold away from parents and spouses torn from each other. Sexual exploitation of enslaved women was common and went unpunished. Yet enslaved people were not merely victims. They resisted their condition in countless ways, from day-to-day acts of defiance to armed rebellion. They maintained cultural traditions, created new forms of music, religion, and community, and found ways to assert their humanity in the face of a system designed to deny it. The cultures that emerged from slavery, blending African, European, and indigenous elements, became distinctive contributions to the heritage of the Americas. The Atlantic slave trade had profound effects on Africa, as well as the Americas. The demand for captives intensified warfare and raiding, disrupting societies across the continent. The loss of millions of people, disproportionately young and healthy, distorted demographic patterns, and stunted economic development. The weapons and other goods exchanged for captives reinforced cycles of violence and created dependencies on European trade. The economic impact of the slave trade on Europe and its American colonies was equally significant. The wealth generated by slave labor built fortunes for plantation owners, merchants, and investors. It financed the development of banking and insurance industries, funded industrial growth, and contributed to European economic dominance. The capital accumulated through slavery and the slave trade was not confined to slave-owning regions, but circulated through the entire Atlantic economy. The moral arguments against slavery developed gradually over the centuries of the trade. Religious voices, particularly among Quakers and evangelical Protestants, began to articulate principled opposition to human bondage during the 18th century. Enlightenment philosophy, with its emphasis on natural rights and human dignity, provided additional grounds for criticism. The campaign for abolition, which achieved its first major victory with Britain's prohibition of the slave trade in 1807, and culminated in the emancipation of enslaved people across the Americas during the 19th century, was one of the great moral movements of modern history. But the legacy of slavery persists. The racial hierarchies, constructed to justify slavery, became embedded in the societies of the Americas and continue to shape inequalities today. The economic disparities created by centuries of exploitation have not been overcome. The cultural contributions of enslaved people and their descendants are integral to the Americas, but so too are the wounds that slavery inflicted. The voyages of exploration, created a global trading system that connected all the inhabited continents for the first time in human history. Goods, people, and ideas circulated around the world along routes that had not existed before the 15th century. This transformation of global trade laid the foundations of the modern world economy and reshaped the societies that participated in it. Before the age of exploration, long-distance trade was constrained by geographic barriers and the limitations of available transportation. The Silk Road connected China with the Mediterranean, but the journey was long, expensive, and uncertain. Maritime trade in the Indian Ocean linked the ports of Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia, but it did not extend to Europe directly. The Americas, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Oceania were largely isolated from this Eurasian trading system. The Portuguese and Spanish voyages changed everything. By finding sea routes around Africa to Asia and across the Atlantic to the Americas, European navigators created the possibility of direct trade between any ports in the world. The oceans, which had been barriers, became highways. The constraints of geography were not eliminated, but they were dramatically reduced. The Portuguese Estado da India, the network of trading posts and fortified bases that Portugal established across the Indian Ocean, was the first European attempt to control global trade. By occupying strategic positions like Goa, Hormuz, Malacca, and Macau, the Portuguese sought to channel Asian commerce through their own hands and extract profits through customs duties and monopoly control of key commodities. The Spanish created a different kind of commercial system in the Americas, focused on extraction of precious metals rather than trade with existing economies. The silver mines of Potosi and Zacatecas produced wealth on an unprecedented scale, most of which flowed to Spain and thence into the wider European economy. The annual treasure fleets that carried American silver to Spain were the greatest concentration of wealth the world had ever seen in transit. American silver transformed the global economy. It provided the means of payment for European purchases of Asian goods, reversing the traditional flow of precious metals from west to east. It funded Spanish imperial ambitions in Europe, financing wars against France, England, and the rebellious Netherlands. It caused inflation across Europe, contributing to social disruption and economic adjustment. And much of it eventually ended up in China, where demand for silver to serve as currency created a massive inflow that reshaped the Chinese economy. Other European powers developed their own overseas trading systems as they challenged the Iberian monopolies. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, became the most powerful commercial organization in the world, controlling much of the spice trade and establishing a colonial presence that stretched from South Africa to Indonesia and Japan. The English East India Company, initially a smaller and less successful rival, would eventually surpass its Dutch competitor and lay the foundations for British rule over India. The pattern of global trade that emerged during the 16th and 17th centuries was often called the triangular trade, though this term oversimplifies a complex system. In its most basic form, European manufactured goods were shipped to Africa, exchanged for enslaved people who were transported to the Americas, and sold for plantation products like sugar, tobacco, and cotton that were then shipped to Europe. But the actual trade flows were far more complicated, involving multiple commodities, routes, and participants. The fur trade in North America, the cod fisheries of the North Atlantic, the textile exports of India, the tea and porcelain of China, the spices of Southeast Asia, all these and more were integrated into a global system that generated enormous wealth for some and terrible suffering for others. The benefits and costs were distributed unequally, both between and within societies. The development of plantation agriculture in the Americas was central to the new global economy. Sugar, the most valuable commodity of the early modern Atlantic trade, was produced on plantations that combined land, labor, and capital in new ways. The plantation system spread to other crops as well, including tobacco in Virginia and Maryland, rice in the Carolina Lowcountry, and eventually cotton across the American South. These plantations were early examples of capitalist agriculture, producing commodities for distant markets rather than for local consumption. They required significant capital investment in land, equipment, and enslaved labor. They operated according to business principles, with careful accounting of costs and revenues. They were, in many ways, precursors of the industrial enterprises that would transform Europe in the following century. The global trade system also facilitated the exchange of ideas and culture. Missionaries carried Christianity to all corners of the world, while indigenous religious traditions sometimes influenced European thought in return. Scientific knowledge accumulated through global observation as explorers documented plants, animals, and peoples unknown to European science. Artistic styles, musical traditions, and culinary practices crossed oceans and blended into new forms. But the global trade system was also a system of exploitation and inequality. It was built on the labor of enslaved people and the dispossession of indigenous peoples. It enriched certain regions and classes at the expense of others. It created dependencies that limited the development of colonized societies. The wealth that flowed to Europe from overseas was not freely exchanged but extracted through systems of coerced labor and unequal exchange. The age of exploration was also an age of colonialism, in which European powers established control over territories far from their homelands and subjected the peoples of those territories to European rule. This colonial expansion transformed the political geography of the world and created patterns of domination and subordination that would persist for centuries. The nature of European colonialism varied according to the circumstances encountered in different regions. In the Americas, where indigenous populations were decimated by disease and could not effectively resist European military technology, colonialism took the form of settlement and demographic replacement. European colonists occupied the land, established farms and towns, and eventually outnumbered the surviving indigenous peoples. In Asia and Africa, where indigenous societies were more resistant to European control, colonialism more often took the form of commercial domination rather than territorial occupation. European powers established trading posts and coastal enclaves, extracting wealth through trade rather than direct settlement. Full territorial colonization of Africa and much of Asia would not occur until the 19th century, when industrialization gave European powers overwhelming military advantages. Spanish colonialism in the Americas was the earliest and in many ways the most complete. By the mid-16th century, Spain controlled an empire stretching from California to Chile, including the former Aztec and Inca empires and much territory beyond. This empire was governed through a complex bureaucratic structure that attempted to maintain royal authority across vast distances and diverse populations. The Spanish colonial system was built on the labor of indigenous peoples and, increasingly, enslaved Africans. The encomienda system, which had been established in the Caribbean, was extended to the mainland, granting Spanish colonists control over indigenous communities that were required to provide tribute and labor. The Mita, an adaptation of an Inca labor draft system, compelled indigenous workers to serve in mines and other enterprises. The Catholic Church was an integral part of Spanish colonialism. Missionaries worked to convert indigenous peoples, often with genuine zeal for saving souls, but also as agents of cultural destruction who suppressed traditional religions and practices. The Church accumulated vast wealth and became one of the largest landowners in the Spanish colonies. Portuguese colonialism took different forms in different regions. In Brazil, Portugal eventually established a colony based on sugar plantations worked by enslaved Africans, similar to the Spanish Caribbean colonies. In Africa and Asia, Portugal maintained a network of trading posts and fortified bases rather than territorial colonies, extracting wealth through commerce and the control of strategic sea routes. English, French, and Dutch colonialism developed later and followed diverse patterns. English colonies in North America ranged from the plantation societies of the Chesapeake and the Caribbean to the settlement colonies of New England, where Puritan religious communities established societies quite different from the Spanish model. French colonies included the plantation island of Saint-Domingue and the sparsely settled territories of Canada and Louisiana, where trade with indigenous peoples was more important than agriculture. Dutch colonialism was primarily commercial, focused on trading posts rather than settlement colonies. The Dutch West India Company briefly held territory in Brazil and established New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island, but these territories were eventually lost to rivals. The Dutch East India Company was more successful, controlling the Indonesian spice trade for centuries and establishing Cape Colony in South Africa. The impact of European colonialism on colonized peoples was profound and often devastating. The demographic collapse of the Americas has already been described, but colonialism caused suffering in other ways as well. Traditional political structures were undermined or destroyed. Economic systems were reoriented to serve colonial needs rather than indigenous welfare. Cultural practices were suppressed, languages were lost, and communities were displaced from their ancestral lands. Yet colonized peoples were not merely passive victims. They resisted colonial rule in countless ways, from armed rebellion to cultural preservation to strategic accommodation. They adapted European technologies and ideas to their own purposes. They formed alliances that sometimes gave them leverage against colonial powers, and they created new cultures that blended indigenous and European elements in complex ways. The colonial system also had significant effects on Europe itself. The wealth extracted from the colonies funded economic development and state building. Colonial administration provided career opportunities for European men and outlets for population growth. The colonies served as markets for European manufactures and sources of raw materials. But colonialism also generated conflicts between European powers competing for territorial and commercial advantage, contributing to the wars that punctuated European history. The legacies of colonialism remain contested and consequential. Former colonial territories continue to grapple with the effects of colonial rule on their political, economic, and social development. Former colonial powers continue to benefit from wealth accumulated during the colonial era, while often failing to acknowledge the full cost of that wealth. The histories written about colonialism reflect these ongoing struggles over how to understand and judge the colonial past. Among the Europeans who sailed to distant lands during the Age of Exploration were missionaries, men and women driven by religious conviction to spread Christianity to peoples who had never heard the gospel. Their efforts represented another dimension of the encounter between Europe and the rest of the world, one that combined genuine spiritual zeal with the cultural arrogance and imperial ambitions that characterized European expansion more broadly. The missionary enterprise was intimately connected with colonialism from its earliest days. The papal grants that authorized Spanish and Portuguese conquest explicitly charged these powers with spreading the Catholic faith to the peoples they encountered. Missionaries accompanied conquistadors, establishing churches in conquered territories and working to convert indigenous populations. The Franciscan, Dominican, and August orders were particularly active in the Americas during the 16th century. These missionary friars established missions, schools, and hospitals across the Spanish colonies, learning indigenous languages and creating written forms for languages that had previously been only oral. Their work produced remarkable documentation of indigenous cultures, even as it contributed to the destruction of those cultures. The encounter between Christianity and indigenous religions was complex and varied. Some missionaries, like the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, became advocates for indigenous peoples, challenging the cruelty of the conquest and arguing for the humanity and rights of the conquered. Others showed little such sympathy, viewing indigenous religions as demonic and indigenous peoples as savages to be civilized by any means necessary. Indigenous peoples responded to Christianity in diverse ways. Some converted sincerely, finding in the new religion answers to spiritual questions or practical advantages in the colonial order. Others resisted, maintaining traditional practices openly or in secret. Many adopted a syncretic approach, blending elements of Christianity with indigenous beliefs and creating new religious forms that satisfied both colonial authorities and traditional spiritual needs. The Virgin of Guadalupe, who according to tradition appeared to an indigenous Mexican named Juan Diego in 1531, became a powerful symbol of this religious synthesis. The Virgin's appearance on a site sacred to an Aztec goddess, her dark skin and indigenous features, and her message delivered in the Nahuatl language all spoke to the possibility of a Christianity that was authentically Mexican. Devotion to Guadalupe became central to Mexican Catholicism and eventually to Mexican national identity. In Asia, the missionary encounter took different forms. The Portuguese Padroado, the royal patronage over Asian missions, brought Franciscans, Dominicans, and eventually Jesuits to India, Southeast Asia, Japan, and China. These missionaries encountered ancient and sophisticated civilizations with their own religious traditions, a very different context from the Americas where European technological superiority was overwhelming. Francis Xavier, one of the founding members of the Jesuit order, arrived in India in 1542 and spent the remaining decade of his life evangelizing in Asia. He baptized thousands in India and Japan, establishing Christian communities that would survive, sometimes underground, for centuries. He died in 1552 on an island off the coast of China, unable to enter the mainland that he had dreamed of evangelizing. The Jesuit mission in China, which began in earnest during the late 16th century, represented a sophisticated approach to cross-cultural evangelization. Jesuits like Mateo Rixai learned Chinese language and culture, dressed in the robes of Confucian scholars, and attempted to present Christianity in terms that Chinese intellectuals could accept. They impressed Chinese elites with European science and technology, gaining access to the imperial court and converts among the educated classes. This accommodation approach generated controversy within the Catholic Church. The Chinese rites controversy, which dragged on for decades, centered on whether converts could continue to practice traditional rituals honoring Confucius and ancestral spirits. The Jesuits argued that these were civil rather than religious ceremonies, compatible with Christianity. Their opponents insisted that they were idolatrous and must be abandoned. Eventually, Rome ruled against the Jesuits, and the China mission's promising beginnings were undermined. In Japan, the Christian mission experienced dramatic success, followed by violent suppression. Xavier and his successors converted hundreds of thousands of Japanese, including some daimyo, the feudal lords who ruled local domains. For a time, Christianity seemed poised to become a significant force in Japanese society. But the unification of Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate in the early 17th century brought an end to the Christian mission. The shogunate saw Christianity as a potential tool of foreign interference and a threat to social order. Beginning in the early 1600s, Christianity was prohibited, missionaries were expelled or executed, and Japanese Christians were forced to apostatize or face martyrdom. Thousands died for their faith, and Christianity survived only in hidden communities that maintained their beliefs in secret for over 2 centuries. Protestant missions developed later than Catholic ones, reflecting the different priorities and circumstances of Protestant Europe. The earliest Protestant missionary efforts were associated with Dutch and English colonialism in North America and Asia. The famous work of John Eliot among the Algonquian peoples of Massachusetts during the 17th century produced the first Bible printed in the Americas, translated into the Massachusetts language. The full flowering of Protestant missions would come in the 18th and 19th centuries, driven by the evangelical revivals that transformed English and American Protestantism. The missionary movement of this period was global in scope, bringing Protestant Christianity to every continent and contributing to the cultural transformation that accompanied European imperial expansion. The legacy of the missionary enterprise is as contested as that of colonialism itself. Missionaries brought literacy, education, and health care to many communities, and their documentation preserved knowledge of cultures that might otherwise have been lost entirely. But they also contributed to cultural destruction, undermined traditional social structures, and served, willingly or not, as agents of colonial domination. The Christianity that spread through mission work was often thoroughly entwined with European cultural assumptions and colonial power relationships. The age of exploration was also an age of mapping. in which the geographic knowledge accumulated by European voyagers was systematized into charts, atlases, and globes that represented the world with increasing accuracy. This cartographic revolution transformed how Europeans understood the planet they inhabited and provided tools that facilitated further exploration and colonization. Medieval European maps had served purposes quite different from modern cartography. The Mappae Mundi, the world maps produced in medieval monasteries, were primarily religious and symbolic rather than geographic. They typically centered on Jerusalem, oriented toward the east where paradise was believed to lie, and distributed the known continents according to theological rather than geographic principles. Practical navigation in the medieval Mediterranean relied on portolan charts, which depicted coastlines and harbors with considerable accuracy, but ignored the interior of continents. These charts, produced by Italian and Catalan cartographers, accumulated navigational knowledge in forms useful for sailors, but did not attempt comprehensive representation of the world. The Portuguese voyages of the 15th century generated new cartographic needs and capabilities. As ships ventured beyond the familiar Mediterranean and into the Atlantic, existing charts proved inadequate. Portuguese cartographers developed new techniques for representing coastlines discovered by explorers, incorporating astronomical observations into their projections, and depicting the curved surface of the Earth on flat paper. The Casa da India in Lisbon became a center for cartographic production, collecting information from returning voyages and synthesizing it into master charts that guided subsequent expeditions. Access to these charts was controlled as a state secret, though the information inevitably leaked to rival powers through espionage, bribery, and the movement of cartographers between employers. The discovery of the Americas created a cartographic challenge that took decades to resolve. Early maps showed the new lands as Asian territories, reflecting Columbus's belief that he had reached the outskirts of China and Japan. Only gradually did European cartographers come to understand that the Americas were separate continents, distinct from Asia and requiring new conceptual frameworks for their representation. The naming of America after Amerigo Vespucci, whose accounts of voyages to the New World helped establish its continental nature, was proposed by the German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller in 1507. His world map, one of the first to show the Americas as separate continents, introduced the name that would become universal, though Waldseemüller himself later had doubts about the attribution. The circumnavigation of Magellan's expedition, or rather the expedition that Magellan began and Elcano completed, provided the first direct measurement of the Earth's circumference by sailing. This voyage confirmed that earlier estimates had been reasonably accurate and established the basic framework within which Pacific geography would eventually be filled in. The Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator developed the projection that bears his name in 1569, creating a map that represented compass bearings as straight lines and thus proved invaluable for navigation. The Mercator projection distorts areas, making regions near the poles appear far larger than their actual size relative to equatorial regions, but its navigational utility ensured its widespread adoption and continued use. Atlases, systematic collections of maps bound together, became popular during the 16th century. Abraham Ortelius published his Theatrum Orbis Terrarum in 1570, generally considered the first modern atlas. Mercator's own atlas, completed by his son after his death, set the standard for cartographic publishing and established the term atlas for such collections. The production of globes became a specialized craft, with famous globe makers creating objects that combined scientific accuracy with artistic beauty. Globes served as status symbols for wealthy collectors, educational tools, and practical aids for understanding geographic relationships that flat maps inevitably distorted. As European explorers mapped more of the world, they also erased indigenous geographic knowledge. Native peoples had their own ways of understanding and representing space, often quite different from European cartographic conventions. Some of this indigenous knowledge was incorporated into European maps, but much was lost or ignored, as European conceptions became dominant. The blank spaces on European maps of the interior of continents represented not emptiness but European ignorance of lands that were well known to their inhabitants. The gradual filling in of these spaces through exploration and colonization was accompanied by the displacement and destruction of the peoples who had lived there for generations or millennia. Maps were not merely representations of geographic reality, but instruments of power. The ability to map territory was associated with the ability to claim and control it. European maps depicted the Americas as lands available for European taking, ignoring or minimizing indigenous presence and sovereignty. Colonial boundaries drawn on maps in European capitals would shape political geography in ways that often ignored local realities and created enduring conflicts. The cartographic achievements of the Age of Exploration were remarkable. Within 2 centuries of Columbus's first voyage, European mapmakers had created reasonable representations of most of the world's coastlines and had begun to fill in continental interiors. The basic shape of the world as we know it today was established through the accumulated efforts of explorers, navigators, and cartographers working across generations. We have now explored the broader consequences of the Age of Exploration, the Columbian exchange that transformed global biology, the Atlantic slave trade that transported millions in chains, the new patterns of global commerce, the spread of European colonialism, the missionary encounter, and the mapping of the world. In our final chapters, we will consider the later phases of exploration, the Enlightenment voyages of discovery, and the lasting legacies of this transformative era. But if sleep is calling, let yourself drift peacefully toward rest. The story will continue whenever you return. Sleep well, dear listener. The world is connected now. Welcome to the final portion of our journey through the Age of Exploration. Whether you have been with us through the preceding chapters or are joining for the first time, let these stories carry you peacefully through the night. The era of Columbus, da Gama, Magellan, and the conquistadors was followed by a period of consolidation during which European powers focused more on exploiting their existing colonies than on seeking new discoveries. But by the 18th century, a new phase of exploration began, driven by the scientific curiosity and imperial ambitions of the Enlightenment age. This later period of exploration differed from its predecessor in significant ways. The voyages of the 18th century were often explicitly scientific in purpose, carrying naturalists, astronomers, and artists who documented the lands and peoples they encountered. The competition between European powers had shifted, with Britain and France now the dominant rivals, while Spain and Portugal's relative power had declined. And the intellectual framework had changed, with Enlightenment ideas about reason, progress, and human nature shaping how Europeans understood their encounters with other peoples. James Cook, the English navigator who made 3 voyages to the Pacific between 1768 and 1779, exemplified this new approach to exploration. Cook was not a nobleman or a conquistador, but a man who had risen through naval ranks on merit. His voyages were sponsored by the Royal Society and the Admiralty, combining scientific objectives with strategic concerns about French expansion in the Pacific. Cook's first voyage, which lasted from 1768 to 1771, was nominally undertaken to observe the transit of Venus from Tahiti, an astronomical event that would help calculate the distance from the Earth to the Sun. But Cook also carried sealed orders instructing him to search for the great southern continent that geographers still believed must exist, and to claim any lands he might discover for Britain. The voyage accomplished more than its planners had anticipated. Cook observed the transit of Venus, circumnavigated New Zealand, and mapped its coastlines with remarkable accuracy, became the first European to explore the eastern coast of Australia, and nearly lost his ship on the Great Barrier Reef. The Endeavour returned to England with a wealth of scientific specimens and data, including the botanical collections of Joseph Banks, who would become one of the most influential scientific figures of his age. Cook's second voyage, from 1772 to 1775, focused on the search for the southern continent. Cook sailed further south than any previous explorer, crossing the Antarctic Circle multiple times and demonstrating that if a southern continent existed, it lay in frozen waters inaccessible to sailing ships. The voyage also visited numerous Pacific islands, adding enormously to European knowledge of Polynesian peoples and cultures. The third voyage, from 1776 to 1779, sought the Northwest Passage from the Pacific side. Cook explored the coast of North America from Oregon to the Bering Strait, trading with indigenous peoples and mapping coastlines that were entirely unknown to Europeans. He then turned south to winter in Hawaii, where he was killed in a confrontation with native Hawaiians in February 1779. Cook's voyages contributed enormously to European knowledge of the Pacific and its peoples. The detailed charts he produced remained in use for decades, while the scientific observations collected by the naturalists aboard his ships filled gaps in European understanding of global flora, fauna, and human diversity. Cook himself became a heroic figure in British popular culture, celebrated as a model of rational, humane exploration. French exploration during this period paralleled British efforts. Louis-Antoine de Bougainville circumnavigated the globe from 1766 to 1769, visiting Tahiti shortly before Cook and producing accounts that contributed to European romanticization of Pacific island life. The ill-fated expedition of Jean-François de la Pérouse, which departed in 1785 and disappeared in 1788, explored the Pacific coast of North America and East Asia before its tragic end in the Solomon Islands. These Enlightenment voyages of exploration were accompanied by significant changes in how Europeans understood the peoples they encountered. Earlier, explorers had typically viewed indigenous peoples through religious categories, as pagans to be converted or as examples of the degradation produced by separation from Christian civilization. Enlightenment thinkers developed more complex, if still problematic, frameworks. The concept of the noble savage, which had roots in earlier periods but became influential during the Enlightenment, portrayed indigenous peoples as living in a natural state uncorrupted by the vices of civilization. Tahiti, as described by Bougainville and others, seemed to offer an example of such natural virtue, a paradise of abundance, sexual freedom, and social harmony. This romanticization, while seemingly more positive than earlier European attitudes, was its own form of misrepresentation. It reduced complex societies to European fantasies, ignored the realities of indigenous life, and justified European intervention as a form of protection against the corrupting influences of the wider world. The noble savage was a European construction, serving European needs, rather than an accurate representation of indigenous peoples. Other Enlightenment thinkers developed evolutionary frameworks that placed human societies on a spectrum from primitive to civilized. Indigenous peoples were seen as representing earlier stages of human development, examples of what European ancestors might have been before achieving civilization. This view, while acknowledging indigenous humanity, also justified European dominance as the natural superiority of a more advanced stage of development. The scientific documentation that accompanied Enlightenment exploration generated enormous quantities of data about the non-European world. Naturalists classified plants and animals according to the systems developed by Linnaeus, filling in the global picture of biological diversity. Ethnographers described indigenous customs, languages, and beliefs, creating records that would later prove invaluable to anthropologists even as they reflected the biases of their authors. The accumulation of this knowledge contributed to the transformation of European science. Darwin's theory of evolution would draw heavily on observations collected during voyages of exploration, including his own journey on the Beagle. The discipline of anthropology emerged from the comparative study of human societies that exploration made possible, and the global distribution of biological specimens established natural history collections that remain important scientific resources today. The final frontiers of terrestrial exploration were the polar regions, the frozen extremities of the Earth that had defeated earlier attempts at passage and remained largely unknown well into the 19th century. The quest to reach the North and South Poles became an obsession for explorers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, producing tales of heroism, tragedy, and endurance that captivated public imagination. Arctic exploration had been driven initially by the search for the Northwest and Northeast passages, but by the 19th century the goal had shifted to reaching the North Pole itself. The pole was located in the frozen Arctic Ocean, inaccessible by ship, and presenting enormous challenges for travel over the ice. Numerous expeditions attempted to reach the pole during the latter half of the 19th century, with varying degrees of success and tragedy. The Franklin expedition of 1845, which sought the Northwest Passage with 2 ships and over 100 men, disappeared entirely, generating years of search expeditions that gradually uncovered the grim fate of its members. The quest to find Franklin added considerably to knowledge of the Canadian Arctic, even as it demonstrated the deadly dangers of polar exploration. The dispute over who first reached the North Pole remains unresolved. American explorers Robert Peary and Frederick Cook both claim to have reached the pole in the early 20th century, Peary in 1909 and Cook claiming to have arrived in 1908. Both claims have been challenged by later analysis, and it is possible that neither man actually reached the geographic pole. The first undisputed surface journey to the North Pole was made by Ralph Plaisted's expedition in 1968, using snowmobiles. Antarctic exploration developed later than its northern counterpart, as the southern polar continent was more remote, and the obstacles to reaching it more formidable. The existence of Antarctica was confirmed only during the early 19th century, when expeditions from Britain, Russia, and the United States sighted the continental coastline. The heroic age of Antarctic exploration, lasting from roughly 1895 to 1917, saw a series of expeditions that mapped the continent, conducted scientific research, and competed to reach the South Pole. The Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen became the first person confirmed to reach the South Pole, arriving in December 1911, after a carefully planned and efficiently executed expedition. The British expedition, led by Robert Falcon Scott, reached the pole just a month after Amundsen, only to discover that they had been beaten in the race. The return journey proved fatal, as Scott and his 4 companions died of exhaustion, starvation, and cold just 11 miles from a supply depot that might have saved them. Scott's diaries, recovered with his body, became a classic of exploration literature, and his fate made him a tragic hero of British imperial mythology. Ernest Shackleton, who had been part of an earlier Scott expedition, led his own Antarctic ventures that demonstrated remarkable leadership under impossible circumstances. His Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition of 1914 to 1917, which aimed to cross the Antarctic continent on foot, failed in its objective when his ship Endurance was crushed by pack ice. But the subsequent journey by Shackleton and his crew to reach safety, involving months surviving on ice floes, a desperate boat voyage to South Georgia Island, and a crossing of the island's mountainous interior, became one of the greatest survival stories in exploration history. Remarkably, every member of the expedition survived. The polar expeditions of this era combined scientific objectives with national prestige and personal ambition. They were among the last great terrestrial explorations, ventures into genuinely unknown territory that required exceptional courage and endurance. The explorers who participated became celebrities, and their stories were eagerly followed by publics, fascinated by tales of adventure in the world's most hostile environments. The age of polar exploration also demonstrated the limits of human endurance and the power of the natural world to defeat even the most determined efforts. The death tolls were significant, and many expeditions failed to achieve their objectives. The polar regions remained largely inaccessible until the development of aircraft and specialized vehicles made travel feasible on a larger scale. Today, permanent research stations operate in Antarctica, and the Arctic Ocean is regularly crossed by ships and aircraft. Climate change is transforming both polar regions, reducing ice cover and opening previously frozen waters to navigation. The Northwest Passage that so many explorers died seeking is now occasionally navigable during summer months. The age of polar exploration is over, but its legacy shapes how we understand these regions and the planet as a whole. Throughout this narrative, we have encountered the costs that the age of exploration imposed on the peoples of the world outside Europe. It is appropriate, as we near our conclusion, to consider these costs more systematically and to reflect on how they should shape our understanding of this era. The demographic impact on the Americas was catastrophic. Indigenous populations declined by perhaps 90% within a century of first contact, a mortality rate unmatched in human history. The causes included epidemic disease, violence, disruption of food systems, and the psychological trauma of social collapse. Entire peoples disappeared, their languages, cultures, and knowledge lost forever. In Africa, the slave trade extracted millions of people over 4 centuries, with profound effects on the continent's development. The violence required to capture and transport enslaved people disrupted societies across West and Central Africa. The loss of so many young and productive people stunted population growth and economic development. The weapons and goods exchanged for captives created dependencies and intensified conflict. In Asia and Oceania, the impacts were more varied but still significant. Indigenous populations in some regions, particularly Australia and the Pacific Islands, experienced demographic collapses similar to those in the Americas. Traditional political and economic systems were disrupted or destroyed. Cultural practices were suppressed in the name of Christianity and civilization. The environmental impacts of European expansion were also substantial. The introduction of European plants, animals, and farming practices transformed landscapes across the Americas and Oceania. Some of these changes were intentional, as colonizers sought to recreate European environments in their new territories. Others were accidental, as species like rats, pigs, and European weeds spread beyond human control. Indigenous species were displaced or driven to extinction by competition with introduced species, hunting, and habitat destruction. The great auk, the Caribbean monk seal, the Steller's sea cow, and countless other species disappeared entirely. Forests were cleared for agriculture and timber, wetlands were drained, and ecosystems that had developed over millennia were transformed within generations. The cultural losses were perhaps less quantifiable, but no less significant. Thousands of languages disappeared, and with them, the unique ways of understanding the world that each language embodied. Religious traditions, artistic styles, oral histories, and accumulated knowledge about local environments all vanished as the peoples who had maintained them died or were forcibly assimilated into colonial societies. Yet it would be too simple to characterize the age of exploration solely in terms of destruction and loss. The encounters between European and non-European peoples were not uniformly negative from the perspectives of those involved. Some indigenous groups allied with Europeans against traditional enemies and derived benefits from those alliances. Some individuals found opportunities for advancement in the new colonial order. And the cultural blending that occurred produced new forms of art, music, religion, and identity that enriched the human heritage. The question of how to assess the age of exploration morally is complex and contested. From a European perspective, the era long appeared as a story of progress, discovery, and the spread of civilization. From the perspectives of indigenous peoples, it more often appears as invasion, conquest, and destruction. Both perspectives contain truth, and neither alone captures the full reality. What seems clear is that the enormous disparities of power that characterized the encounters between Europeans and other peoples made genuine exchange impossible. The knowledge, resources, and labor that flowed from the Americas, Africa, and Asia to Europe were not freely given but extracted through systems of coerced labor and unequal exchange. The benefits of the new global economy were distributed profoundly unequally, and the costs fell most heavily on those least able to resist. The age of exploration created the world we inhabit today. The connections established between continents during the 15th and 16th centuries have only intensified in subsequent centuries, producing a globalized world in which goods, people, ideas, and diseases circulate constantly around the planet. The demographic legacies are visible in the populations of the Americas, which today include descendants of indigenous peoples, European colonizers, enslaved Africans, and more recent immigrants from around the world. The cultural blending that began during the colonial period continues, producing hybrid identities and cultures that defy simple categorization. The political geography of the modern world reflects colonial boundaries and categories. National borders in Africa and Asia often follow lines drawn by colonial powers, sometimes grouping together peoples with little in common and separating those with historical connections. The nation-state system that organizes global politics was largely a European export, imposed through colonization and imitated by peoples seeking to resist colonial domination. Economic inequalities between the global North and South have roots in the colonial extraction of wealth that began during the Age of Exploration. The development paths of former colonial territories continue to be shaped by their colonial experiences, though the specific effects are debated among scholars. Some argue that colonialism was fundamentally destructive of indigenous development. Others point to infrastructure and institutions that colonial powers established. Most recognize that the picture is complex and varies significantly between different colonial experiences. The environmental consequences of global connection continue to unfold. Species introduced during the colonial era continue to spread and cause ecological disruption. The global trade system that developed from colonial commerce now transports goods, and with them organisms, around the world with unprecedented speed. Climate change, caused primarily by fossil fuel consumption that began with European industrialization, now threatens ecosystems worldwide, including many that had survived the earlier waves of colonial environmental transformation. The intellectual legacies of the Age of Exploration include the global science that accumulated knowledge from around the world into unified systems of understanding. Linnean taxonomy, Darwinian evolution, and modern anthropology all drew on observations made during voyages of exploration. The ideal of objective, universal knowledge that characterized Enlightenment science was both a genuine intellectual achievement and a framework that often dismissed or appropriated indigenous knowledge systems. The religious landscapes of the world were transformed by missionary activity that accompanied exploration and colonization. Christianity spread to all inhabited continents, becoming the world's largest religion. But traditional religions did not simply disappear, they adapted, blended with Christianity, and in some cases revived in reaction against Christian dominance. The religious pluralism of the modern world is in part a product of the encounters that the Age of Exploration initiated. The technologies developed for oceanic exploration laid foundations for subsequent innovations. The shipbuilding advances of the exploration era eventually produced the steam-powered and then motor-powered vessels that carry global trade today. The navigational techniques developed for Atlantic and Pacific voyaging evolved into the sophisticated systems that guide modern ships and aircraft. The global communication networks that began with colonial administration now connect billions of people instantaneously. How should we understand the Age of Exploration in the 21st century? This question has become increasingly contested as societies grapple with the legacies of colonialism and as voices previously marginalized in historical narratives demand recognition. The traditional narrative of the Age of Exploration celebrated European achievement, the courage of explorers who ventured into unknown waters, the navigational and technological innovations that made their voyages possible, the expansion of human knowledge about the planet, and the creation of connections that ultimately produced the modern world. This narrative was not false in what it affirmed, but it was seriously incomplete in what it omitted. The critique of this traditional narrative has emphasized the costs imposed on non-European peoples, the demographic collapse of indigenous populations, the horrors of the slave trade, the exploitation and destruction that accompanied colonization, and the persistent inequalities that these processes created. This critique has been essential for achieving a more accurate and complete understanding of what the age of exploration actually involved. But moving beyond both celebration and condemnation toward genuine understanding requires grappling with complexity. The peoples who participated in exploration and colonization were not monolithic categories, but diverse groups with varied motivations and experiences. Indigenous peoples were not merely victims, but actors who made choices, resisted when they could, and adapted when they had to. The processes set in motion during the age of exploration produced outcomes that no one intended or foresaw. The question of how to commemorate figures like Columbus has become a flashpoint for these debates. Statues have been removed, holidays renamed, and the traditional celebrations of exploration questioned. These controversies reflect genuine disagreements about how to weigh the achievements and the crimes of historical figures, and about whose perspective should guide public memory. There are no easy answers to these questions. Columbus was both a skilled navigator who accomplished something unprecedented, and a man whose treatment of indigenous peoples was cruel, even by the standards of his time. Celebrating his achievement without acknowledging his cruelty is dishonest. Condemning his cruelty without acknowledging his achievement is equally incomplete. Perhaps the most productive approach is to recognize that the age of exploration, like all historical periods, was shaped by people who were neither heroes nor villains, but complex human beings, acting within the constraints and possibilities of their circumstances. Understanding them requires neither celebration nor condemnation, but the effort to see the world as they saw it while also recognizing what they could not or would not see. This means taking seriously the religious motivations that drove many explorers and colonizers, even when their actions seem to us incompatible with the values they professed. It means recognizing the genuine achievements of exploration, including advances in knowledge that benefited humanity as a whole. And it means acknowledging fully the terrible costs that these achievements entailed, without allowing the achievements to excuse the costs or the costs to erase the achievements. History is not a morality play in which good and evil are clearly distinguished and appropriately rewarded or punished. It is the record of human beings making choices in conditions they did not fully understand, with consequences they could not foresee. The age of exploration reminds us of both human capability and human cruelty, of both the wonders we can achieve and the horrors we can inflict. We have now completed our journey through the age of exploration, from the first tentative Portuguese ventures along the African coast to the Enlightenment voyages that completed the mapping of the world. We have followed explorers across oceans, witnessed the rise and fall of empires, traced the flows of people, plants, animals, and diseases that connected once separate worlds, and reflected on the legacies that continue to shape our lives today. The world that emerged from the age of exploration was fundamentally different from the world that preceded it. The Americas, unknown to Europeans before Columbus, became the site of colonial empires that would eventually give birth to independent nations. Africa and Asia were drawn into trading relationships and eventually colonial rule that transformed their societies. The Pacific, the last great geographic frontier, was mapped and incorporated into a global system that left no inhabited region untouched. The knowledge accumulated during this era transformed human understanding of the planet. Maps that had once shown monsters and speculation now depicted coastlines and continents with reasonable accuracy. The classification of plants and animals began to reveal the patterns of life across the globe. And the diversity of human cultures, documented by missionaries and naturalists, and eventually anthropologists, challenged European assumptions about human nature and society. Yet the costs of this transformation were terrible. The demographic collapse of indigenous peoples, the millions transported in chains across the Atlantic, the destruction of cultures and ecosystems, the establishment of inequalities that persist to this day, these too are legacies of the age of exploration. Any honest reckoning with this era must acknowledge both what was gained and what was lost, both the achievements and the crimes. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps you can hold these complexities in your mind, not resolving them into simple conclusions, but allowing them to remain as open questions. The age of exploration was a time when human beings demonstrated both remarkable courage and terrible cruelty, when the world was transformed in ways both wonderful and devastating, when the maps were redrawn forever. We are all inheritors of this history, shaped by connections and divisions that were established during these centuries of exploration and colonization. Understanding this history does not provide simple lessons for the present, but it does remind us that the world we inhabit is not natural or inevitable, but the product of choices made by human beings, choices that might have been made differently, and that continue to be made today. The ocean is calm tonight. The stars that guided explorers across unknown waters still shine overhead, though we no longer need them for navigation. The world that once seemed infinite in its mystery is now thoroughly mapped and photographed, yet it remains full of wonders that we are still discovering. Sleep now, dear listener. Let the gentle rhythm of imaginary waves carry you toward rest. The stories we have shared tonight are part of your heritage as a human being, part of the long journey that brought us all to this moment. May your dreams be peaceful, and may you wake refreshed, ready to continue the ongoing human voyage of discovery. The age of exploration ended long ago, but the exploration of what it means to be human, to share this planet with billions of others, to inherit a past we did not choose and to shape a future we will not see, this exploration continues. Sleep well. The journey continues.